In the final hours of Constantinople, the empire still knew how to pray. Inside the great church of Hagia Sophia, candlelight moved across gold mosaics, across marble columns, across faces that had not slept properly in weeks. The air was thick with incense, smoke, sweat, and fear. Priests chanted beneath the dome, as if sound itself could hold the world together. Somewhere beyond the walls, Ottoman cannon waited in the dark, their iron mouths still warm from the day's work. The city still called itself Roman. Its people still lived beneath the shadow of emperors. Its churches still spoke the language of eternity. Its walls still carried the confidence of centuries. From a distance, Constantinople could still look like a miracle made of stone, a sacred capital planted between Europe and Asia, guarding the Bosporus like a lock on the door of the world. But by the spring of 1453, miracles had become expensive. The empire that had once ruled coastlines, armies, ports, provinces, tax districts, and kings had been reduced to a city and a few scattered fragments of land. The title remained. The ceremonies remained. The memory of Rome remained. The material power behind them had almost vanished. That was the terrible beauty of Byzantium in its last days. It did not end as a savage tribe in ruins or as a forgotten kingdom swallowed quietly by time. It ended as a sacred performance still being carried out after the stage had begun to collapse. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor, stood at the center of that performance. He was not the ruler of a vast Mediterranean world. He did not command the wealth of Egypt, the armies of Syria, the grain routes of North Africa, or the military depth of Anatolia. Those old sources of imperial strength had been lost across centuries of war, plague, diplomacy, religious conflict, and betrayal. What he possessed was something stranger. He possessed a name: Roman Emperor. It was one of the most powerful titles ever created by human imagination. It had survived civil wars, barbarian kingdoms, Arab sieges, Persian invasions, icon-breaking emperors, ambitious generals, crusader violence, and dynastic decay. For more than 1,000 years, men had killed for that title, prayed under it, taxed in its name, marched behind its banners, and used it to make ordinary political decisions feel part of a cosmic order. But a title cannot repair a wall. It cannot feed unpaid soldiers. It cannot make foreign kings act when they prefer hesitation. It cannot turn an exhausted city back into an empire. Outside Constantinople, Mehmet II understood something the old world did not want to admit. He was not merely attacking a city. He was attacking the last living claim that Rome still belonged to the Christians of the East. The young Ottoman Sultan brought cannon, men, ships, engineers, and a political will sharpened by ambition. His siege was not a raid, it was a statement. The future had arrived with gunpowder. The past answered with bells. For weeks, the Theodosian walls had taken the punishment. These walls had resisted armies for centuries, and the people of Constantinople had learned to treat them almost as a second religion. They were not just stone, they were memory. Fathers had told sons that the city could not fall while the walls still stood. Priests had blessed them. Soldiers had died on them. Emperors had trusted them. But in 1453, the walls faced a new kind of pressure. Cannon fire did not respect legend. It did not care how many sieges had failed before. It did not bow before mosaics or imperial titles. It hit stone again and again until sacred confidence became dust. A monk brushing candle soot from an icon while the ground trembled beneath his feet. For them, history was not an argument. It was sound. The deep crack of artillery. The scrape of tools repairing broken masonry. the murmur of prayers. The city fell in 1453, but the empire had been bargaining with reality for centuries before that morning. Every time Byzantium survived, it paid. It paid in provinces, it paid in gold, it paid in soldiers, it paid in religious unity. It paid in trade privileges granted to foreign merchants. It paid in the pride of emperors forced to beg for Western aid. It paid in the slow humiliation of a state that still spoke like Rome while living with the resources of a shrinking frontier kingdom. And yet, this is also why the Byzantine story is so extraordinary. Most empires are remembered for conquest. Byzantium must be understood through survival. It survived when the Western Roman Empire broke apart. It survived Persian War. It survived Arab expansion. It survived the loss of some of its richest provinces. It survived theological civil war over sacred images. It survived military defeats that should have ended it. It survived the greed of allies and the violence of crusaders. It survived even the capture of its own capital in 1204. Again and again, it changed shape. It became more Greek, more Christian, more defensive, more diplomatic, more ceremonial, more suspicious, more brilliant in the arts of endurance. It learned how to turn weakness into negotiation, geography into strategy, ritual into authority, and delay into a weapon. But there was a hidden cost in becoming so good at surviving. A state that survives by shrinking may one day discover that it has preserved the name while losing the body. A court that survives through ceremony may begin to mistake performance for strength. A sacred empire that survives by turning every crisis into proof of divine endurance may struggle to admit when endurance is no longer enough. By 1453, Constantinople was full of old symbols. The emperor still wore the inheritance of Rome. Hagia Sophia still lifted its dome above the city. The walls still stretched across the landward side like a promise made in stone. The clergy still prayed. The people still hoped. The court still understood the language of imperial dignity. But beneath the symbols lay the harder inventory. Too few soldiers, too little money, too few reliable allies, too many enemies, too much history pressing down on one city. This was the final contradiction of Byzantium. It had turned survival into an art, but art could not stop iron. To understand how the last Roman emperor reached that night inside the walls, we cannot begin with the fall. We have to go back to the beginning, to the moment when a ruler looked at an old empire and decided that its future would not be built in Rome. It would be built on the Bosporus. It would be built where ships crossed between continents, where trade could be watched, where armies could be delayed, where a capital could be protected by water, walls, ceremony, and belief. Before we move into that origin, remember this. History does not begin with ruins. It begins with decisions that once looked wise. If you want more stories like this, where empires are not treated as legends, but as living systems that rise, adapt, and slowly pay for their own survival, subscribe and follow the next chapter. Because before Constantinople became Rome's last ghost, it was Rome's boldest answer to fear. And that answer began with Constantine. Before Constantinople became a city under siege, it was a decision made against fear. Not fear in the simple sense, not panic, not cowardice, not the trembling of one ruler before one enemy. It was the deeper fear of a man looking at the Roman world and understanding that the old center could no longer hold everything together. Rome still had its name. But by the 4th century, the empire's true pressures were no longer gathered neatly around Italy. The Danube frontier demanded soldiers. The eastern provinces demanded attention. Persia remained a permanent danger beyond the Euphrates. Trade moved through the eastern Mediterranean with a force Rome could not ignore. Grain, tax, ships, roads, bishops, generals, merchants. The machinery of rule had stretched far beyond the city that had once given the empire its soul. Constantine understood geography as power. On the Bosporus, he saw something Rome could no longer offer: a capital placed like a hand on the throat of movement itself. Ships crossing between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass nearby. Armies moving between Europe and Asia could be watched, delayed, negotiated with, or trapped. The waters formed natural defences. The Golden Horn curved like a protected harbour. Land approached the city from one vulnerable side, where walls could turn geography into policy. It was not merely beautiful, it was useful. The old Greek city of Byzantium had occupied this place long before Constantine made it imperial. But Constantine did not choose it because it had a romantic past. He chose it because it answered the questions that mattered to a ruler responsible for an empire too large, too threatened, and too politically unstable to be governed by memory alone. In 330, the city was dedicated as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Later generations would call it New Rome, not because it replaced Rome in one clean moment, but because it offered an answer to a problem Rome itself had created. How could an empire built around conquest continue to govern a world where distance had become danger? The answer was stone, water, administration, and belief. Imagine the harbour in those early decades before the full weight of legend settled on the city. A dockworker stands near the Golden Horn at dawn, his hands rough from rope and salt. Marble blocks arrive by ship. Grain sacks are unloaded. Officials move with wax tablets and lists. Soldiers watch the quays not as decoration, but as part of a city learning to become a command centre. The smell is not only incense and ceremony. It is tar, wet wood, fish, sweat, animal dung, and the sour breath of crowded trade. This was how empire became physical, not in speeches, in docks, in ledgers, in walls measured, repaired, guarded, and paid for. Constantinople was designed to make power concentrate. Court ritual could be staged there, tax revenue could be counted there, bishops could debate there, envoys could be received there. Armies could be dispatched from there. The city was not just a residence for an emperor, it was a machine for turning distance into information, and information into command. But Constantine's city also carried a second force, one that would shape Byzantium more deeply than geography alone: Christian legitimacy. Constantine did not create Christianity, and he did not instantly transform the Roman Empire into the medieval Orthodox world that would come later. The process was messier, slower, and full of argument. But under him, imperial authority and Christian language began to move closer together. The emperor could now appear not only as a military ruler or legal sovereign, but as a figure with a role in the sacred ordering of the world. That union would become one of Byzantium's greatest strengths. It would also become one of its most dangerous habits. A normal capital can lose a battle and still remain a city. Constantinople was different. Over time, it became a statement about heaven, empire, law, and destiny. Its walls did not merely protect people. Its churches did not merely host worship. Its ceremonies did not merely flatter rulers. Together, they taught subjects and foreigners alike that the empire was not simply another political arrangement. It was the continuation of Rome under divine supervision. This made obedience feel larger than politics. It also made failure harder to admit. The early city grew with an ambition that was both practical and theatrical. Forums, palaces, churches, baths, avenues, and defensive works turned the old Byzantium into an imperial capital. Statues and monuments connected the new city to the Roman past. Administrative offices connected it to the living empire. Christian patronage pointed it toward the future. Constantine was not building a retreat, he was building a claim. A claim that Rome could move without dying. A claim that imperial authority could survive relocation. A claim that the old empire could take a new shape without confessing weakness. The choice worked better than anyone in the 4th century could have fully known. When the western half of the Roman world became increasingly unstable, the eastern capital had advantages that mattered with almost brutal clarity. It stood closer to wealthy provinces. It had access to trade routes. It could draw on administrative traditions that remained stronger in the east. It could defend itself with water and walls. It could act as a diplomatic theatre where foreign envoys were impressed, delayed, bribed, converted, or confused. Power often depends less on being invincible than on making enemies pay too much for victory. Constantinople was built to raise that price. Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Crusaders, and Ottomans would all learn in different centuries that taking this city was not like taking an ordinary capital. The approach mattered, the harbours mattered, the walls mattered, the currents mattered, the food supply mattered, the morale of defenders mattered. The city turned geography into endurance long before endurance became the empire's central art. Yet the same design that protected Byzantine power also began to shape Byzantine imagination. A capital this strong could teach its rulers confidence. A capital this sacred could teach them that survival was proof of favor. A capital this symbolically loaded could make the empire's center feel more real than the provinces that fed it. Over time, Constantinople would become so dominant in the imperial mind that losing territory elsewhere could be treated as temporary, while holding the city felt like holding history itself. That belief was powerful. It was also narrowing. Because no capital, however magnificent, can replace the material base that sustains it. Walls need soldiers. Soldiers need pay. Pay requires taxes. Taxes require land, people, harvests, roads, officials, and a state capable of enforcing its claims beyond the glow of palace ceremony. Constantine's decision gave the empire a new heart. But a heart cannot live without limbs. For centuries, Constantinople would prove the brilliance of its location. It would outlast enemies who looked stronger. It would absorb shocks that would have shattered weaker capitals. It would turn siege after siege into a lesson in patience. It would give the Eastern Roman state a center so durable that later historians would struggle to explain how any empire could survive so many disasters. But the price of that durability was psychological. The city made survival possible, and because survival was possible, later emperors would often choose delay over cure, compromise over reconstruction, ceremony over confession. The capital could endure long enough for problems to become traditions. It could give the state time, and time in politics is both medicine and poison. In the beginning, none of this was visible. There was only the city rising, ships in the harbour, stone dragged into place, officials copying names, bishops arguing doctrine, soldiers watching the water. Constantine's new capital gathering the empire's eastern weight into one defensible point. The decision looked wise because it was wise. That is what makes the story darker. Byzantium did not begin with a mistake. It began with one of the most successful strategic choices in imperial history. A city was placed where geography, commerce, defense, ceremony, and religion could reinforce one another. For centuries, that choice would keep the empire alive. But success has a way of hiding its own future cost. The city that protected the empire would one day outshine the empire. The capital that made Rome portable would one day become the last place where Rome still seemed real. And long before Ottoman cannon reached the Theodosian walls, Constantinople had already taught its rulers a dangerous lesson. If the city still stood, perhaps the empire had not truly failed. That belief would carry Byzantium through disasters. It would also make some disasters easier to deny. And the first great test of that belief would come not from a foreign army at the gates, but from an emperor who wanted to make the Roman world whole again, and nearly burned his capital in the attempt. Smoke rose over Constantinople before the empire tried to conquer the past. In January 532, the city that Constantine had built as the answer to Rome's uncertainty nearly tore itself apart from within. The Hippodrome, usually a theatre of races, factions, cheers, colours, and imperial performance, became the heart of a rebellion. The Blues and the Greens, rival chariot factions whose anger had long been folded into the politics of the capital, found a common cry: Nika, conquer. At first, it sounded like the roar of the crowd. Then it became something more dangerous: the sound of a city discovering that its emperor was not untouchable. Justinian had been emperor for only a few years. He came to power in 527 with a mind shaped by ambition, law, theology, and the Roman past. He did not want merely to rule what remained, he wanted to restore what had been lost. To him, the western provinces were not foreign lands. North Africa, Italy, Rome itself. These were not memories to be mourned from a distance. They were pieces of an imperial body that could, perhaps, be reattached. But before Justinian could attempt to restore the world, he had to survive his own capital. The Nika revolt burned through Constantinople with a violence that exposed the fragility beneath imperial ceremony. Buildings were set aflame. The palace was threatened. The crowd backed a rival claimant. For a moment, the sacred machinery of rule seemed to stop. The emperor who dreamed of reconquest found himself trapped behind palace walls, forced to decide whether his reign would end not on a battlefield, but in the streets of his own city. Later tradition gives Theodora, his empress, one of the most dramatic moments in Byzantine memory. According to Procopius, when flight was considered, she argued that imperial purple made a noble burial shroud. The exact shape of the scene belongs to a source that must be handled with caution. Procopius was brilliant, bitter, and not always innocent. But whether the words were spoken exactly as recorded is less important than what the story reveals. The palace understood the danger. If Justinian fled, the imperial image would break. He stayed. Then came the slaughter. Belisarius, Mundus, and loyal forces moved against the rebels. Thousands were killed in the Hippodrome. The rebellion was crushed with the kind of violence that makes authority visible again. When the smoke cleared, Justinian still had the throne, but the city around him had been wounded. Constantinople had not merely witnessed disorder, it had seen how quickly obedience could burn. The emperor's answer was not retreat. It was construction. Out of the ashes of the revolt, Justinian rebuilt Hagia Sophia on a scale that made politics look like heaven. The church rose not only as a place of worship, but as a declaration that imperial authority had survived judgment by fire. Stone, marble, gold, geometry, and light were turned into argument. The dome seemed to float above the earth. The building told the city that the emperor had not been humbled by rebellion. He had been confirmed by survival. But every sacred image has a material underside. Somewhere below the dome, hands carried the weight. A mason working on the new church would not have experienced Justinian's ambition as an abstract vision of Christian Rome. He would have known the grind of hauling stone, the burn of lime dust in the throat, the scrape of tools against marble, the shouted orders of supervisors, the danger of scaffolding, the pressure of deadlines imposed by men who spoke in the emperor's name. The empire became visible in polished surfaces, but it was built by bodies that sweated, slipped, bled, and disappeared from the official story. Hagia Sophia was glory. It was also labor. That double truth defined Justinian's reign. He was one of the most extraordinary rulers Byzantium ever produced. His government did not merely dream, it acted. His jurists gathered and organized Roman law into what became the Corpus Juris Civilis, a legal achievement whose influence would travel far beyond his lifetime. His generals crossed seas and reopened the Western question. Belisarius defeated the Vandals in North Africa in the 530s with a speed that must have seemed almost miraculous to those who believed Rome could still be restored. Carthage returned to imperial control. The Mediterranean for a moment looked less like a broken inheritance and more like a map being repaired. Then Italy called. The Ostrogothic kingdom had ruled there, but Justinian saw Italy not as someone else's realm, but as the old center of Roman meaning. Belisarius entered the peninsula. Rome changed hands. Ravenna mattered. Siege followed siege. Later, Narses would help complete what Belisarius had begun. On parchment, the reconquest looked like restoration. In imperial imagination, it must have felt like history bending backward. But the ground told another story. Italy was not simply recovered, it was exhausted. War damaged cities, fields, roads, and populations. Armies had to be paid. Garrisons had to be maintained. Local cooperation had to be managed. The empire could win territory faster than it could make that territory profitable again. Victory returned old names to imperial control, but names did not automatically produce tax revenue. This is the problem that makes Justinian's reign so darkly important. He achieved things that were real, and some of those achievements weakened the future. North Africa, Italy, legal reform, church construction, frontier defense, court ceremony. All of it required money, discipline, manpower, and administrative reach. Justinian's government was capable, perhaps more capable than almost any other state of its time. But capability can become dangerous when it convinces rulers that every problem can be solved by adding one more campaign, one more tax, one more decree, one more act of will. The empire under Justinian did not lack vision. It had almost too much of it. The tax collector became the unseen companion of the emperor's dream. In a village far from Constantinople, the restoration of Roman greatness might arrive not as a golden mosaic, but as an assessment. A local official with a wax tablet or parchment list would measure obligations in grain, coin, labor, or animals. The names in the register belonged to households, not symbols. A bad harvest did not erase what the state expected. A son taken for service did not erase what the treasury needed. The reconquest of distant Italy could become a pressure felt in a field that would never see Rome. That is how imperial grandeur travels downward. It becomes a demand. Justinian also ruled in an age of theological intensity. The emperor did not imagine religion as separate from political order. In Byzantium, doctrine mattered because belief was not merely private. It shaped unity. It shaped obedience. It shaped the meaning of imperial rule. Disputes over Christology, church councils, bishops, and imperial religious policy were not side issues beside war and taxation. They were part of the structure holding the empire together or pulling it apart. A ruler who claimed to defend Christian truth could strengthen legitimacy. He could also inherit every argument about what truth meant. Justinian wanted unity in law, unity in faith, unity in territory, unity in imperial memory. His reign was a campaign against fragmentation. That is why it feels so magnificent from a distance. He saw broken pieces and tried to make them whole. The tragedy is that some broken things cannot be restored without breaking something else. Then came the plague. Beginning in the 540s, the pandemic, often called the Justinianic plague, struck the Mediterranean world. The exact demographic scale remains debated, and historians continue to argue over its full consequences. But the event belongs in the story because even a powerful state depends on human bodies. Taxpayers, soldiers, sailors, farmers, clerks, priests, merchants, and gravediggers. When disease tears through that human base, it does not only produce sorrow, it weakens administration, it thins armies, it disrupts harvests, it changes what a treasury can realistically demand. A law code can survive plague. A tax system cannot collect from the dead. The empire Justinian left behind was larger, more glorious, more legally ordered, more architecturally unforgettable, and more strained. His reign gave Byzantium some of its most enduring monuments and memories. Hagia Sophia would stand as one of the supreme sacred spaces of the medieval world. The Corpus Juris Civilis would outlive the political conditions that produced it. The reconquests would make later generations remember Justinian as the emperor who almost restored Rome. Almost. That word matters. Because Justinian's restoration was never the return of the old Roman world in full strength. It was a brilliant, costly, partial recovery imposed upon a changed Mediterranean. The West had new rulers, new military realities, damaged cities, altered loyalties. The East had its own frontiers to defend. Persia still mattered. The Balkans still mattered. The treasury had limits. Disease had no respect for imperial plans. The emperor had reached backward with extraordinary force, but history did not move backward with him. In the visual memory of Byzantium, Justinian could appear almost superhuman, the builder, the lawgiver, the restorer, the emperor beneath the dome. Yet the deeper story is more uncomfortable. He showed what Byzantine power could accomplish when ambition, bureaucracy, faith, and military talent converged. He also showed how success could become a burden carried by the generations that followed. The empire had survived rebellion. It had rebuilt its sacred center. It had crossed the sea and reclaimed ancient territories. But beneath the gold, pressure had gathered. The state that emerged from Justinian's reign was not weak. That would be too simple. It was impressive, disciplined, and still capable of enormous action. But it had spent heavily to look like the old Rome again, and the bill did not vanish when the emperor died in 565. It remained in the forts. It remained in the tax registers. It remained in the western territories that needed soldiers. It remained in the eastern frontier, where Persia still watched. The empire had tried to restore the world. Soon it would have to fight merely to keep one. There are victories that save an empire only long enough for it to understand how exhausted it has become. When Heraclius came to power in 610, the Roman world in the east was already bleeding. The crisis was not theatrical. It was not the elegant crisis of a court afraid of scandal or a palace worried about ceremony. It was the raw political terror of provinces falling, armies failing, and the old enemy of Persia pressing deeper than imperial pride could bear. The Sasanian Empire had become more than a rival. It had become a mirror of Byzantine fear. For generations, Rome and Persia had faced one another across the eastern frontiers, trading fortresses, tribute, raids, treaties, and exhaustion. But in the early 7th century, the balance broke. Persian armies advanced into Byzantine territory with frightening force. Syria was threatened. Anatolia was shaken. Egypt, one of the richest and most vital provinces of the empire, came under pressure. Jerusalem fell to the Persians in 614, an event that struck not only the strategic map, but the sacred imagination of the Christian Empire. To lose a city is one thing, to lose Jerusalem was something darker. It suggested that imperial protection and divine favor were no longer moving together. Heraclius inherited that terror. He was not simply a new emperor trying to strengthen a troubled state. He was a ruler standing in the ruins of confidence. The government needed money. The army needed rebuilding. The churches needed reassurance. The provinces needed protection. The people needed an explanation for why the empire that claimed to defend Christian order could no longer defend some of its holiest places. In Constantinople, the rituals continued. But ritual alone could not push back Persia. The emperor had to turn the remaining strength of the state into action. That meant raising funds, reorganizing military effort, and asking the empire to endure more pressure at the very moment it was already wounded. The church, the treasury, aristocrats, soldiers, provincial communities, all were pulled into the emergency. Heraclius did not have the luxury of ruling a comfortable empire. He had to make a desperate one move. Imagine a clerk in the capital during those years, bent over a table in dim light, copying figures from provinces that no longer sent what they once had. Wax, parchment, dust, and lamp smoke fill the room. The numbers are not abstract to him. They show absence. A district disrupted by invasion. A shipment delayed. A tax expectation that no longer matches the land beneath it. Somewhere above him, imperial language still speaks of recovery. On the page before him, recovery has to become grain, coin, animals, men. The empire was not saved by courage alone. It was saved, for a time, by extraction. Heraclius's campaigns against Persia became one of the most dramatic military reversals in Byzantine history. Rather than wait passively behind walls, he carried war into enemy territory. In the 620s, he struck with a mobility and boldness that changed the emotional direction of the conflict. His forces moved through Armenia and the Caucasus. He pressured the Persian heartland. The war became not merely a defensive struggle, but a contest of endurance between two old imperial systems that had pushed each other toward exhaustion. In 627, near Nineveh, Heraclius won a crucial victory over the Persians. The symbolism was immense. Nineveh evoked the ancient Near East, the ghosts of older empires, the long memory of conquest and judgment. Byzantine forces had gone from near collapse to battlefield success. The Persians, already strained by internal instability, could no longer sustain the same pressure. The war's end brought the return of territories, and, in Christian memory, the recovery of the true cross from Persian hands. The empire had survived. The emperor had become a savior. For a moment, history seemed to have restored meaning. But the victory came late, and lateness matters. By the time the Persian War ended, both great powers had been badly drained. Armies had marched too far, treasuries had been strained, fields had been damaged. Populations had lived under invasion, taxation, requisition, and uncertainty. The frontier world between Rome and Persia had not been gently rearranged. It had been scraped raw by decades of conflict. Heraclius had defeated Persia. He had not restored the world that existed before the war. That distinction would become catastrophic, because almost immediately a new force rose from Arabia and struck into lands both empires had weakened themselves trying to possess. The early Arab-Muslim conquests did not enter a stable world. They entered a world where the two great imperial powers of the Near East had exhausted each other. Persia would collapse entirely. Byzantium would survive, but survival now meant losing some of the richest and most important provinces it had ever ruled. Syria, Palestine, Egypt. These were not borderlands of minor value. They were part of the empire's wealth, food, manpower, theological life, and administrative depth. Their loss changed everything. It changed what the emperor could tax. It changed where armies could be raised. It changed how Constantinople related to the Christian East. It changed the empire's balance between Mediterranean breadth and Anatolian defense. It changed the meaning of being Roman. The old empire had been a world. The new one would become a fortress. The shock unfolded through battles and decisions that later generations would compress into a clean story of defeat. But the lived experience would have been messier. Governors negotiated. Cities weighed resistance against surrender. Local populations, many of them alienated by imperial religious policy or exhausted by war, faced choices made under pressure. Soldiers marched through heat and dust, often without the confidence that the old military system could still protect them. At Yarmouk in 636, Byzantine forces suffered a major defeat against Arab armies. The consequences moved faster than imperial language could adjust. Syria could no longer be treated as secure. Palestine slipped away. Egypt, with Alexandria and the Nile's wealth, followed in the years after. The empire that had once looked east and south as natural parts of its body now had to learn what it meant to live without them. A merchant in Alexandria might have understood the transformation before the palace did. The harbour still smelled of salt, rope, oil, fish, and grain dust. Ships still came and went. But the authority behind the taxes, the seals, the officials, and the soldiers was changing. A man who had once paid into the Roman imperial system now found himself inside a different political order. For the merchant, the theological arguments of Constantinople mattered less than the practical question: who controls the port, who protects the ships, and who collects the money? Empire becomes real at the point of payment. When Egypt was lost, Constantinople did not simply lose a province, it lost a pillar. Grain, revenue, and strategic depth weakened. The Eastern Mediterranean was no longer an imperial lake. The religious map shifted. Monophysite and Chalcedonian tensions, already difficult, now existed under new political conditions. The emperor could still claim universal authority, but entire Christian communities no longer lived under his direct rule. The sacred story had been compressed by military reality. This was the moment Byzantine identity began to harden. The state still called itself Roman, and its people would continue to understand themselves in Roman terms. But the empire after the Arab conquests was no longer the broad Eastern Mediterranean superpower of Justinian's imagination. It was leaner, more defensive, more Greek-speaking in practical life, more centered on Anatolia and Constantinople, more dependent on fortified survival. Heraclius had wanted to save the empire from Persia. He ended up ruling during the transformation of the empire itself. That is not because he failed in the simple sense. He did what few rulers could have done. He inherited disaster and produced victory. He forced Persia back. He restored morale. He gave the empire one last moment in which the old Christian Roman story seemed vindicated. Then the ground moved beneath him. The tragedy of Heraclius is that he won the war he understood, only to face a crisis shaped by a world no one in Constantinople had fully imagined. His reign marks one of history's cruel transitions, from the last great Roman-Persian war to the first age of Islamic expansion, from imperial restoration to imperial contraction, from Mediterranean confidence to fortified endurance. The empire did not disappear. That matters. Many states would have broken completely under the weight of such losses. Byzantium bent, recoiled, reorganized, and continued. But the continuation came at a price that would define the next centuries. A smaller tax base had to support a still imperial court. Fewer provinces had to carry the idea of universal rule. Anatolia became not just territory, but the military spine of survival. Constantinople became more central than ever because so much else had been taken away. The sacred capital still stood, but now it stood for an empire learning to live without many of the lands that had once made its sacred claims believable. In the churches, defeat had to be explained. In the bureaucracy, loss had to be calculated. On the frontiers, new defensive patterns had to be improvised. In villages across Anatolia, families would begin to experience empire less as glory than as obligation. Service, taxation, flight, rebuilding, watchfulness. The world after Heraclius was colder, not empty, not defeated beyond repair, but colder. The age of Justinian had tried to restore the old Roman body. The age after Heraclius had to preserve the vital organs and let the lost limbs go. This was not the romantic image of empire. It was triage. A state that had once dreamed in the language of reconquest now had to learn the discipline of contraction. And in that contraction, Byzantium discovered one of its most important talents, the ability to shrink without admitting that shrinking meant surrender. It would not be the last time. Soon the empire would stop asking how to restore the world of Justinian and start asking a harder question. How does a sacred empire survive when surrounded, reduced, and forced to become something smaller than its own name? The answer would be built in Anatolia, in fortresses, in military districts, in burned fields, in mountain roads, and in the hard patience of people who no longer expected victory to look glorious. Byzantium had survived the storm. Now it had to become the shelter. The empire did not survive by pretending nothing had changed. It survived because at some point, reality became too sharp to ignore. After the losses of the 7th century, Byzantium was no longer the broad Mediterranean power Justinian had imagined. Syria was gone. Egypt was gone. Much of the old Eastern world had slipped beyond imperial control. The map had contracted, and with it, the old confidence of universal rule. Constantinople still spoke with the voice of Rome, but the state behind that voice had become smaller, poorer, more defensive, and more dependent on the lands that remained, especially Anatolia. The peninsula became the empire's shield, wound, storehouse, and recruiting ground. Its roads, mountains, plateaus, fortresses, villages, and military districts now carried the weight once spread across far richer provinces. If Constantinople was the mind and face of the empire, Anatolia became its battered body, the place where raids were absorbed, armies were rebuilt, and survival became a daily practice rather than a ceremonial claim. The old dream of restoration had not vanished completely, but a harder instinct had taken command. Hold the passes, protect the villages when possible, retreat when necessary, delay the enemy, preserve the army, keep the capital supplied, make conquest expensive. This was not the glamorous side of empire. There were no domes floating above gold light here, no legal code polished for centuries of admiration, no emperor stepping into history as the restorer of the Roman world. This was an empire learning the politics of endurance in dust, snow, mud, and stone. Somewhere in Anatolia, a frontier soldier would have known that truth better than any court official. He might stand near a mountain road before dawn, cloak stiff with cold, leather damp from night mist, listening for movement beyond the ridge. The fortress behind him is not magnificent. Its stones are patched, its stores are limited, its men are tired. Somewhere below, a village waits to see whether this season will bring taxes, raiders, conscription, or all three. For him, Byzantium is not a golden mosaic. It is a watchtower. It is a ration of hard bread. It is the sound of horses where no horses should be. The empire's genius during this period was not that it avoided weakness. It was that it organized weakness into a system. Historians debate the exact origins and development of the theme system, and it should not be imagined as one neat reform created in a single afternoon by one brilliant ruler. It evolved under pressure, but the basic transformation mattered. Military and administrative life in the remaining territories became more closely tied to regional defense. Soldiers, land, taxation, and local command were connected in ways meant to help the state survive repeated attack. This was a different kind of imperial thinking. Earlier, Rome had expanded through roads, cities, law, and professional military reach. The shrunken Byzantine state had to preserve itself through layered defense, mobile response, fortified settlements, and the careful use of limited resources. It could no longer afford to fight every conflict as a grand campaign for universal restoration. It had to decide what could be defended, what could be abandoned, and what must never be lost. Constantinople belonged to the last category. The capital became even more important after the loss of the eastern and southern provinces. Its survival was not just strategic, it was psychological. If Constantinople stood, the empire could claim continuity. If the emperor still ruled from the city of Constantine, then the Roman story had not ended. If Hagia Sophia still rose above the capital, then divine order could still be imagined above political contraction. But this made the city both strength and burden. The state had to feed it, defend it, impress through it, and speak from it. The capital gave the empire legitimacy, yet also demanded resources from a shrinking base. Every wall repaired, every guard paid, every ship maintained, every ceremony performed required material support from lands increasingly exposed to war. Survival had become an economy. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Arab pressure did not simply arrive as one invasion and disappear. It came through campaigns, raids, sieges, naval threats, and frontier war. The Arab sieges of Constantinople, especially in the later 7th century and again in 717 to 718, tested the city's defenses and the state's ability to endure under immense pressure. The capital survived, but survival required more than courage. It required walls, food, ships, discipline, weather, diplomacy, and weapons capable of making the sea itself dangerous. Greek fire entered Byzantine memory almost like a miracle. Its exact formula remains uncertain, and later descriptions can become legendary. But its effect was real enough to matter. A weapon projected from ships, burning on water, or seeming to defy ordinary expectations, gave the Byzantine navy a terrifying advantage in moments of crisis. Against enemy fleets, it was not merely a tool of war. It was theatre, fire as imperial argument. Imagine an enemy sailor seeing flame move across the water, not in a hearth, not in a battlefield torch, on the sea itself. For the men watching from Byzantine decks, the weapon must have seemed like proof that the empire still possessed secrets. In a world where territories had been lost and armies strained, technological and naval advantage could become a kind of compensation. The state could no longer dominate every frontier, but it could make certain approaches deadly. It could not restore the old map, but it could keep the enemy from taking the city that made the map meaningful. The empire was learning to survive through selectiveness. This is one reason Byzantium endured when many expected it to disappear. It did not always need to defeat an enemy completely. Sometimes it only needed to outlast the campaign. Sometimes it needed to hold the city until weather, supply, disease, or politics weakened the attacker. Sometimes it needed to pay one enemy to fight another. Sometimes it needed to give ground and weight. The court would never describe this as weakness. It would describe it as prudence, divine favor, imperial patience, strategic wisdom. Sometimes that was true. Sometimes it was simply the language rulers use when they have no better option. In the provinces, the cost of this defensive intelligence was paid slowly. Villages near the frontier might be moved, raided, taxed, fortified, or emptied. Fields could be burned. Families could flee towards safer districts. Local officials had to extract revenue from communities whose capacity had already been damaged by war. Soldiers tied to land might be expected to defend a system that did not always protect them in return. A tax register from such a world would be more than an administrative object. It would be a map of pressure. Names written before a raid, land assessed before harvest failure, obligations fixed by the state even when reality had shifted beneath the ink. The empire needed those records because without taxation there could be no army, no walls, no fleet, no court, no diplomacy, no sacred performance in the capital. But the more the state demanded from damaged communities, the more survival itself became a burden distributed downward. That is the hidden violence of endurance. It does not always look like massacre. Sometimes it looks like another levy, another son called to serve, another animal taken, another official arriving with a seal. The emperor in Constantinople could speak of defending Christian order. The frontier heard the hoofbeats first. Yet it would be a mistake to see this period only as decline. Byzantium's ability to adapt after the 7th century disasters was one of the most impressive achievements in medieval statecraft. Many empires collapse when they lose their richest provinces. Byzantium changed its scale, language of defense, military organization, and expectations. It became less universal in practice, but more intensely coherent around what remained. The state hardened. The culture changed. The old Latin inheritance did not disappear, but Greek increasingly dominated the life of administration, religion, and identity. The empire remained Roman in its own understanding, but it was no longer Roman in the way Justinian had tried to make it. It became a Christian Roman state centered on Constantinople, Anatolia, ceremony, and survival. Less expansive, more concentrated. Less Mediterranean-wide, more fortress-like. Less confident in conquest, more skilled in recovery. This transformation gave Byzantium time to absorb shocks, time to rebuild armies, time to let enemies overextend, time to turn geography into resistance, time to become something new while insisting it had remained the same. That last habit would become one of the empire's defining contradictions. Byzantium changed constantly in order to claim continuity. It adapted so that it could say it had not surrendered. It shrank so that it could continue speaking as if the imperial idea remained whole. There was intelligence in that. There was also danger, because adaptation can save a state while teaching it to live with losses it should have confronted more honestly. A lost province becomes a temporary wound, then a memory, then a theological explanation, then a line in a chronicle. The capital still stands, so the story continues. The emperor still reigns, so the order must still be real. The liturgy still rises, so the world must still be held together. But the villages knew better. The soldiers knew better. The officials counting missing revenue knew better. Byzantium had become a civilization of controlled retreat, and controlled retreat requires discipline of a very high order. Too much retreat, and the state dissolves. Too little, and the army is destroyed. Too much taxation, and the population weakens. Too little, and the frontier collapses. Too much reliance on local military power, and governors become dangerous. Too much central control, and the provinces cannot respond fast enough. This was the narrow path the empire now walked. Not glory, balance. Not restoration, endurance. In later centuries, Byzantium would again expand, again recover confidence, again produce great emperors and terrifying enemies. But the lesson of this age never disappeared. Beneath every revival lay the memory of contraction. Beneath every ceremonial claim lay the knowledge that the empire had once survived by becoming smaller than its own name. And then came the question that would tear through the sacred center of that survival. If the empire had shrunk because God allowed it, what did that mean? If Christian Rome had lost Jerusalem, Syria, Egypt, and much of the old Eastern world, where had divine favor gone? If icons, relics, prayers, churches, emperors, bishops, and sacred images filled the empire, why had disaster still come? The next crisis would not begin with a foreign army at the walls. It would begin with images, with painted faces, with gold backgrounds, with monks, emperors, soldiers, bishops, and ordinary believers asking whether the empire's sacred symbols protected it or provoked judgment against it. Byzantium had learned how to shrink. Now it would have to decide what heaven looked like. The next civil war of Byzantium began with a face painted on wood. Not a fortress, not a border, not a throne surrounded by armed men. A face. Christ, the Virgin, a saint, an angel, a martyr. Gold leaf behind the head, dark eyes fixed on the believer, a hand raised in blessing, a body made present through color, prayer, and touch. To a worshipper, an icon was not simply decoration. It was a window, a holy presence, a point where heaven seemed to lean close enough for human hands to tremble. But to an emperor ruling after defeat, siege, plague, and contraction, the question was more dangerous. What if these images had become part of the problem? What if the empire had filled its churches with sacred pictures while God allowed its provinces to fall? What if the painted face was not protection, but provocation? By the early 8th century, Byzantium was a state still alive, but deeply shaken. It had survived the loss of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and much of the old Eastern world. It had resisted Arab pressure. Constantinople had endured. The empire had learned to shrink, fortify, reorganize, and wait. But survival did not answer the theological wound left by catastrophe. A Christian empire had lost holy lands. A Roman emperor had watched his world contract. A sacred state needed to explain why heaven had allowed it. This is where politics entered the sanctuary. Leo III, who came to power in 717, was not ruling from comfort. His reign began under severe pressure, including the great Arab siege of Constantinople in 717 to 718. The city survived, and that survival strengthened the idea that decisive imperial leadership could rescue the Christian Roman state from disaster. But it also sharpened a darker instinct. If the empire's fate depended on divine favor, then religious practice could no longer be treated as merely devotional. It became a matter of state security. Around 726, according to later tradition, Leo began moving against the veneration of icons. The precise details and chronology are debated, and the sources are complicated by later writers who often stood on one side of the controversy. But the crisis itself is undeniable. Imperial authority challenged sacred images. Bishops, monks, soldiers, officials, and ordinary believers were pulled into a dispute over what could be seen, touched, kissed, defended, destroyed, or forbidden. At first glance, iconoclasm may sound like a purely theological quarrel. It was not. It was a struggle over who had the right to interpret disaster. If icons were dangerous, then emperors who removed them could present themselves as reformers restoring divine order. If icons were holy, then emperors who attacked them were not saving the empire. They were wounding its soul. The argument did not stay inside monasteries. It entered military camps, palace policy, church councils, village devotion, imperial propaganda, and the private fear of people who had already lived through too many losses. Imagine a monk before dawn, somewhere in a monastery far from the marble confidence of Constantinople. The room smells of beeswax, damp wool, old wood, and cold stone. He lifts an icon from its place, wraps it in cloth, and hides it behind a loose panel or beneath stored vessels. No dramatic speech is needed. No secret name has to be invented. The gesture itself says enough. He is not hiding art. He is hiding obedience to a different authority. For that monk, the emperor may command armies and laws, but the painted face carries another claim. A ruler can issue decrees. He cannot easily command memory, grief, habit, and prayer. When believers have touched an icon during sickness, carried it in procession, kissed it after childbirth, or wept before it in hunger and fear, the image becomes woven into the life of the community. Remove it, and the state does not merely change decoration. It reaches into the emotional architecture of faith. That is why iconoclasm cut so deeply. It placed the emperor inside the most intimate spaces of devotion. Constantine V, Leo's son, pushed the iconoclast position with even greater force. His reign was militarily active and, in some ways, successful. He fought the Bulgars. He strengthened imperial authority. He was not a foolish ruler flailing in superstition. That is important. Bad history turns iconoclasm into simple madness or cruelty. The reality is sharper. Intelligent rulers can make spiritually violent decisions when they believe the survival of the state is at stake. For iconoclast emperors, the removal of images could be framed as purification. For icon defenders, it looked like sacrilege. The question became impossible to contain because it touched the core Byzantine relationship between heaven and rule. The emperor was not a modern secular king. He stood within a sacred order. Court ceremony, church ritual, imperial victory, and divine approval were bound together in ways that made religion a language of government. If the emperor could define proper worship, then his reach extended toward the altar. If monks and bishops could resist him in the name of holy tradition, then spiritual authority could limit the throne. This was not only about images, it was about boundaries. Where did imperial command end? Where did sacred truth begin? And who decided when the empire was being punished? The iconoclast crisis also exposed social tensions inside Byzantine life. Monasteries were not merely quiet places of prayer. They could hold wealth, land, influence, manuscripts, networks of loyalty, and moral authority. Monks could become symbols of resistance. Their refusal carried weight because they did not rule armies, yet they could challenge the emperor's claim to define Christian order. That made them dangerous. An emperor can tolerate many kinds of weakness more easily than rival legitimacy. A soldier on the eastern frontier might have viewed the dispute differently from a monk in a chapel. He had seen raids, hunger, discipline, commanders, and danger. If an emperor brought victory and order, perhaps the emperor's religious policy seemed part of the same harsh medicine that kept the state alive. For some military communities, iconoclast emperors may have appeared practical, stern, and necessary. The empire had suffered too much for every devotional habit to remain untouched. This tension prevented the controversy from becoming a simple story of pious people against tyrants. The empire was divided by experience. Those who feared idolatry saw reform. Those who loved icons saw violation. Those who needed military success saw discipline. Those who lived by monastic devotion saw persecution. Those in the capital saw policy. Those in villages saw familiar holy faces vanish. Byzantine unity was being tested not by an enemy outside the walls, but by the meaning of holiness inside them. The first major attempt to settle the issue came under Empress Irene. In 787, the Second Council of Nicaea restored the veneration of icons, carefully distinguishing veneration from worship. It was a theological compromise with political weight. Icons could return, but the language around them had to be controlled. The council did not merely say images were allowed. It tried to explain how they could belong inside orthodox belief without becoming idols. For a time, the wound seemed treated, but not healed. Iconoclasm returned in the 9th century, driven again by military anxiety, imperial pressure, and the old fear that defeat revealed divine anger. The second phase was not simply repetition. It showed that the original question had never fully disappeared. As long as the empire connected battlefield outcomes with God's favor, military disaster could reopen theological suspicion. When armies failed, images could again be accused. When enemies advanced, devotion could again be examined as policy. The crisis finally ended in 843 with the restoration of icons, later celebrated as the triumph of orthodoxy. The name itself tells us how Byzantium remembered the settlement. Not as administrative adjustment, not as aesthetic preference. Triumph. The empire did not merely permit images again. It transformed their restoration into a statement about true belief, imperial order, and sacred continuity. Icons returned not as fragile objects alone, but as signs that the church had passed through fire and preserved its identity. Yet the victory carried a mark. Byzantium had survived another internal crisis, but survival again came with a lesson. The sacred could not be separated from rule. A painted panel could reveal the structure of the state. A church dispute could expose the anxieties of soldiers. A monastery could become a political force. An emperor could win battles and still be remembered as an enemy of holiness. The empire after iconoclasm was not less religious. It was more intensely aware that religion was a battlefield. This awareness shaped Byzantine culture for centuries. Icons became central to devotion, identity, art, theology, and imperial self-understanding. They were no longer merely inherited practices, they were defended practices. Their survival gave them emotional force. To venerate an icon after 843 was not simply to continue tradition. It was to stand inside a tradition that had been attacked and restored. The gold background now carried memory. The painted eyes had survived policy. The image had endured the emperor. That mattered because Byzantium needed symbols that could survive damage. The empire's political world had changed. Its borders had narrowed. Its armies had been tested. Its provinces had been lost. But its sacred culture became deeper, more disciplined, more self-conscious. The crisis over icons helped define what Byzantine Christianity would become. Not a vague imperial faith, but a civilization of ritual, image, doctrine, ceremony, and memory fused together. Still, there was danger in that fusion. When sacred identity becomes the language of survival, every political failure can sound like a theological accusation. Every defeat asks what sin caused it. Every reform risks becoming heresy. Every emperor who touches worship risks being judged not only as a ruler, but as a man who reached too far into heaven. Byzantium emerged from iconoclasm with icons restored, but it did not emerge innocent. The controversy had shown that the emperor's authority, though immense, could not simply command belief into silence. It had shown that monks and images could outlast decrees. It had shown that the people's emotional attachment to sacred objects was part of the empire's strength, not a decorative side of it. And it had shown that a state fighting for survival might be tempted to discipline the soul as tightly as it disciplined the frontier. The frontier still mattered. The army still mattered. Taxes, fortresses, officials, roads, and grain still mattered. But after iconoclasm, one truth became impossible to ignore. Byzantium was not held together by institutions alone. It was held together by the belief that those institutions belonged to a sacred order. Damage that belief, and the empire did not merely lose confidence. It lost part of the language through which it explained itself. The next age would reveal what happened when that language, the military system, and the imperial will all began to work together again. For a time, Byzantium would rise. The armies would push outward. The court would recover confidence. Scholars would copy texts. Emperors would again speak not only of defense, but of victory. A dynasty from Macedonia would give the empire one of its most powerful revivals, and under Basil II, Byzantine discipline would become feared across the Balkans. But the question left by iconoclasm would remain beneath the gold. If God had restored the empire's images, would he also restore its world? For a while, Byzantium remembered how to advance. Not with the reckless hunger of Justinian reaching across the sea to restore a world already changed. Not with the desperate improvisation of Heraclius saving the empire while watching provinces disappear. This was something colder, more disciplined, and in some ways more dangerous. A state that had survived long enough to make survival look like strength again. By the late 9th century, the empire had changed shape. It was smaller than the Mediterranean world Justinian had imagined. It was more Greek in language, more orthodox in identity, more concentrated around Constantinople and Anatolia. It had learned to defend, retreat, negotiate, and absorb punishment. It had passed through the wound of iconoclasm and emerged with its sacred images restored. The empire was not whole in the old Roman sense, but it was no longer merely bleeding. In 1867, Basil I took power and founded what later historians call the Macedonian dynasty. His origins were obscure, his rise violent and political, and the dynasty's name itself is more complicated than the simple label suggests. But what mattered for the story of Byzantium was not only the man, it was the moment. The state he entered had endured enough to recover. The old defensive system in Anatolia had not vanished. The court had not lost its administrative memory. The church, after the restoration of icons in 843, had regained a stronger sense of doctrinal identity. The army still had problems, but it was not broken. The treasury, though never free from pressure, could still support policy when rulers used it with discipline. Byzantium had become narrower. That narrowness now became focus. In Constantinople, the revival could be seen in ceremony, scholarship, law, and art. Texts were copied. Classical learning was preserved and reorganized. Imperial ideology became more polished. The court understood how to turn ritual into hierarchy, clothing into rank, processions into political education. A foreign envoy entering the palace did not simply meet a ruler. He entered a staged universe where every curtain, silence, chant, jewel, and movement suggested that the emperor stood at the center of an ordered Christian cosmos. This was not decoration. It was diplomacy. A throne room could do work that an army did not need to do. If a visitor was overwhelmed by gold, incense, mechanical devices, chanting, embroidered robes, and the impossible choreography of court life, then imperial power had already begun shaping his imagination before negotiations started. Byzantium had learned that ore could be a weapon, cheaper than war, safer than conquest, and useful when the map did not fully match the imperial claim. But outside the palace, power still had to become land, roads, soldiers, and grain. Somewhere in a village in Anatolia, a family might hear that another son was being called towards service on a frontier they had never seen. The room smells of smoke from a small hearth, wool drying near the wall, bread cooling on a rough board. The father knows what the imperial order means before anyone explains it. A campaign far from home will take labor from the field. A horse, a weapon, a tax obligation, a season of absence, these are not abstractions. They are the price by which the empire turns recovery into movement. The court celebrates victory. The household counts what victory costs. The Macedonian revival depended on this exchange. Central ambition drawing strength from provincial bodies. In earlier centuries, the empire had survived because Anatolia absorbed shock. Now that same military base helped it push outward again. Campaigns in the east began to recover ground from Muslim frontier powers. Fortresses changed hands, roads reopened. The frontier no longer felt only like a wound, it became a zone of pressure, raiding, negotiation, and eventual expansion. This was not an instant golden age, it was accumulation. A recovered fortress here, a better command there, a marriage alliance, a legal refinement, a punished rebel, a tax structure enforced with more confidence, a frontier army that believed again it could win. Byzantine recovery did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as administration learning how to breathe after centuries of constriction. Under emperors such as Nikephoros II Phokas and John I Tzimiskes in the 10th century, the eastern campaigns gave the empire a more aggressive edge. Nikephoros, a soldier emperor, represented the hard military aristocracy that had grown from the frontier world. He was not made for soft ceremony alone. His career was shaped by war, discipline, and the brutal practicality of campaigning. Crete was recovered in 9061 before he became emperor, a major blow against Muslim naval power in the eastern Mediterranean. Cilicia and parts of Syria came under renewed Byzantine pressure. The old empire had dreamed of universal restoration. The Macedonian Empire practiced selective recovery. That difference mattered. Justinian had tried to make the Mediterranean Roman again. The 10th century emperors concentrated on pressure points that strengthened the state's security and prestige. They did not need to restore all of Rome to prove that Byzantium was alive. They needed to show that the empire could still choose an enemy, prepare a campaign, and force the frontier outward. John Tzimiskes continued the military momentum after Nikephoros. His reign was short but active. The empire projected force into the Balkans and the east. Bulgaria became a central concern. Syria remained a field of opportunity and danger. The frontier world had become a school for emperors who understood that power was not preserved by ceremony alone. But the very men who made the empire strong also revealed a future threat. The military aristocracy had land, followers, prestige, and command experience. They were useful because they could fight. They were dangerous because they could become too powerful to manage. Every successful general carried a double meaning in Byzantium. He was a shield against enemies and a possible rival to the throne. The empire needed strong men on the frontier, but Constantinople feared strong men who discovered that soldiers might obey them more readily than they obeyed a distant emperor. This tension would never fully disappear. The revival reached its most disciplined and frightening form under Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025. His reign began under pressure, including civil wars and challenges from powerful aristocratic families. Basil did not inherit effortless stability. He had to force obedience. That struggle shaped him. He became hard, not in the simple sense of cruelty for its own sake, but in the more consequential sense. A ruler who understood that aristocratic power, military prestige, and provincial autonomy could quietly hollow out imperial authority if left unchecked. Basil II spent much of his reign disciplining enemies inside and outside the empire. He fought rebels. He reduced the danger of great landholding families. He turned imperial will into a long campaign against those who might make the state serve private ambition. His most famous struggle was against Bulgaria. For decades, Byzantine and Bulgarian power collided in the Balkans. Samuel of Bulgaria built a formidable resistance, and the war did not end quickly. It demanded patience, campaigning, logistics, and the ability to keep pressure over many years. Basil's eventual victory in 1018 brought Bulgaria under Byzantine control and marked one of the great achievements of the medieval empire. By then, Basil had become a figure almost too severe for legend. Later memory gave him the name Bulgar Slayer, attached especially to the grim story of blinded Bulgarian prisoners after the Battle of Clydion in 1014. The details and scale of that episode should be handled carefully, because medieval accounts often sharpen violence into moral theatre. But the political meaning is clear. Basil's war against Bulgaria was remembered not as a polite campaign of borders, but as a demonstration of imperial punishment, endurance, and domination. The empire had found again the power to terrify. Yet even at this height, the revival carried its own hidden weakness. Basil II was effective partly because he was relentless. He restrained aristocrats. He campaigned. He watched the machinery of rule closely. He left the treasury strong. He extended Byzantine authority. He restored fear around the imperial name. But a system that works because one ruler disciplines every fracture can become vulnerable after that ruler is gone. The question was not whether Basil was strong. He was. The question was whether his strength had built successors capable of carrying the same weight. That is where the shadow enters the revival. A clerk in Constantinople near the end of Basil's reign might see the empire at its most impressive on paper. Revenues recorded, territories recovered, titles distributed, military commands organized, Bulgaria subdued, the emperor feared. The court functioning, the church secure. To a man copying documents beneath lamplight, with ink on his fingers and dust gathering near the shelves, the state might look solid in the way only records can look solid. But records do not show the weakness of the next generation. They do not show ambition waiting behind obedience. They do not show whether a system has become mature or merely controlled. The Macedonian revival is important because it proves that Byzantium was not simply declining for 1,000 years. That is lazy history. The empire recovered, reorganized, attacked, legislated, negotiated, and produced cultural brilliance. It could lose and return. It could shrink and expand. It could absorb crisis and use the memory of crisis as discipline. For viewers, this matters because it prevents the Byzantine story from becoming a straight road to 1453. The fall of Constantinople was not inevitable from the beginning. There were moments when the empire was intelligent, adaptable, and frighteningly capable. There were moments when enemies misjudged it and paid. There were moments when the court ceremonies were backed by armies that could still change the map. Byzantium was not a ghost yet. Under Basil II, it was very much alive. And perhaps that is why the next stage is so painful. Because collapse after weakness is easy to explain. Collapse after recovery is harder. When a state has already proven it can survive, every later failure feels less like fate and more like mismanagement, overconfidence, or a discipline that could not be inherited. The empire after Basil stood near one of its medieval peaks. The Balkans were subdued, the eastern frontier was stronger, the treasury was healthy. The imperial office still carried sacred authority. Constantinople still glittered. The wounds of earlier centuries seemed, if not healed, then at least contained. But Basil II left no son to continue his method. He left strength. He did not leave certainty. After his death in 1025, the empire would discover the difference between a system that functions and a system that depends on the man forcing it to function. Court politics would grow softer. Aristocratic land power would press harder. Military discipline would loosen. The throne would pass through hands that inherited Basil's empire without inheriting Basil's severity. For a while, the surface still shone. The ceremonies continued. The titles remained. The maps still looked impressive enough to comfort those who wanted comfort. But beneath that surface, the empire's next disaster was already assembling itself. Not at the walls of Constantinople, not in the smoke of a foreign siege, but in the quiet corridors after a great ruler's death, where everyone suddenly learns how much fear had been doing the work of law. After Basil II died in 1025, the empire still looked strong. That was the danger. From the outside, Byzantium appeared to stand near the height of its medieval power. Bulgaria had been subdued. The eastern frontier had been strengthened. The treasury was healthier than it had been under many earlier rulers. Constantinople still glittered with ceremony, law, icons, ambassadors, processions, and the cold confidence of a capital that had survived too much to doubt itself easily. The old emperor was gone, but the structure he had disciplined remained. At least, that was what the court wanted to believe. The death of a powerful ruler does not always create a crisis at once. Sometimes the first years after him feel deceptively calm. Officials continue their routines. Titles are granted, ceremonies are performed, foreign envoys are received. The palace still smells of incense, polished stone, dyed silk, and candle smoke. The empire speaks in the same formal voice it used before. But something invisible has changed. Fear has left the room. Basil II had ruled for nearly half a century. He had broken rebellions, contained aristocratic ambition, fought Bulgaria into submission, and treated imperial authority as something that had to be enforced, not admired. His strength lay not only in victory, but in attention. He watched. He punished. He distrusted the great families whose estates and military influence could turn service into private power. After him, the throne passed to Constantine VIII, his brother. Constantine VIII inherited the empire Basil had hardened, but not Basil's habits. He had the imperial name, the court, the treasury, the ceremonies, and the machinery of command. What he lacked was the same severe relationship to rule. He did not build his legitimacy through long campaigns or brutal administrative discipline. The imperial office still stood, but the man inside it did not carry the same weight. This is where decay often begins. Not with flames, not with invasion, not with a dramatic betrayal, but with a quiet change in standards. What Basil had treated as dangerous, later rulers treated as manageable. What he had restrained, others tolerated. What he had watched closely, others allowed to drift. The Byzantine aristocracy did not need to overthrow the empire in order to weaken it. It only needed time, land, influence, marriages, offices, exemptions, and access to the court. Great families could gather estates. Provincial elites could turn local strength into political leverage. Military command could merge with private ambition. The state still existed above them, but its grip loosened when emperors lacked the will or ability to keep them afraid. Somewhere in Anatolia, the change would have appeared in a form far less grand than palace politics. A provincial official sits with land records spread before him. The room is narrow, hot, and dusty. Ink dries too quickly on the reed pen. Outside, animals shift in the yard, and a line of villagers waits with the tired silence of people who already know the decision was made before they arrived. The records show small holdings absorbed into larger estates. Names that once belonged to independent households now appear under the influence of men with better connections, more protection, and friends closer to Constantinople. Nothing in the room looks like collapse. It looks like paperwork. But paperwork can change the fate of armies. The old strength of Byzantium depended heavily on the relationship between land, taxation, and military service. If too much land gathered in the hands of powerful families, the balance shifted. Smallholders could become dependent. Tax obligations could be manipulated. Military recruitment could weaken. Provincial power could become less responsive to central command. The emperor might still issue orders from Constantinople, but the living resources beneath those orders had begun to move into private hands. Basil II had understood this danger. His successors did not control it with the same force. The empire after 1025 did not collapse immediately because institutions still possessed momentum. A well-built system can continue moving for a while after the person who guided it is gone. The treasury did not empty overnight. The army did not disappear in one season. The frontiers did not break all at once. The court did not suddenly forget how to govern. That was precisely why the danger could be ignored. When weakness arrives slowly, officials can mistake it for adjustment. The 11th century became a period of court-centered politics, shifting emperors, powerful families, and fragile successions. Zoe and Theodora, the daughters of Constantine VIII, became central figures in the imperial line. Through marriage, adoption, palace maneuver, and dynastic necessity, the throne moved through men whose legitimacy often depended less on command than on proximity to the Macedonian bloodline. This did not make them meaningless, it made them vulnerable. A ruler who gains the throne through marriage to imperial legitimacy must constantly prove that he is more than an attachment to it. A court that can manufacture emperors through ceremony can also drain emperors of authority. The sacred theatre of Constantinople could elevate a man, dress him in purple, surround him with chants, and present him as God's chosen ruler. But ceremony could not give him Basil's discipline. In the palace, succession became performance. A new emperor could appear under the mosaics, receive acclamations, sign decrees, and enter the rhythm of rule. Yet everyone watching understood the hidden question: who truly controlled the machinery behind the robe? The emperor himself? The empress? The eunuchs? The generals? The bureaucrats, the great families waiting with polished obedience. Byzantium had always been a court society as well as a military state. That was not new. But after Basil, the court's ability to consume political energy became more dangerous because the frontier still required serious attention. The empire could not afford to become only a palace. It needed soldiers, roads, forts, commanders, tax revenue, and discipline across regions that did not care how elegant Constantinople's ceremonies looked. On the eastern frontier, new pressures were building. The Seljuk Turks were becoming a force that Byzantine policy could not treat as distant noise forever. In Italy, Norman power was rising against Byzantine holdings in the south. In the Balkans, old tensions never fully disappeared. The empire had enemies on multiple edges, and those edges demanded a ruling class capable of strategic seriousness. Instead, the center increasingly rewarded intrigue. This does not mean every emperor after Basil was foolish. History is rarely that convenient. Some rulers saw problems, some tried to govern responsibly. Some understood that the army mattered, but the rhythm of the age tilted toward instability. Short reigns, factional influence, fiscal choices that weakened military structures, and a dangerous separation between the polished confidence of the capital and the harsher realities of the provinces. The army felt this separation. A soldier stationed far from Constantinople might hear the emperor's name change more often than his own equipment. He might serve under commanders whose loyalty belonged partly to the state, partly to family interest, partly to survival. He might watch fortifications neglected while court factions debated honor, rank, marriages, and precedence. His boots still wore down on the same roads. His ration still depended on supply. His enemies did not become less real because the palace had become more theatrical. There is a kind of imperial weakness that begins when the center stops listening to the frontier. Not because the frontier is always wise, but because it pays first. By the middle of the 11th century, the Byzantine state still possessed impressive resources. Constantinople remained wealthy and formidable. The empire's cultural confidence was high, its diplomacy was sophisticated, its court remained one of the most dazzling in the known world. The problem was not that Byzantium had become helpless. The problem was that it had become easier to pretend that inherited strength was the same as renewed strength. An empire can live for a long time on the work of previous generations. It can spend old discipline, old victories, old fear, old institutions, old roads, old walls, old prestige. For a while, the spending feels like continuity. Only later does someone notice that the reserves are lower than they seemed. After Basil, Byzantium spent. It spent the authority he had accumulated. It spent the fear he had imposed on rivals. It spent the strategic depth won through long wars. It spent the credibility of a system that still looked solid because no single crisis had yet exposed the hollow spaces. Then the crises began to converge. The Normans pushed in southern Italy. In 1071, Bari, the last major Byzantine possession in Italy, would fall to them. In the east, the Seljuk challenge would culminate in the same year at Manzikert, where Romanos IV Diogenes attempted to confront the threat directly. That emperor, unlike some before him, understood that military weakness could no longer be hidden beneath ceremony. But by then, the problem had become larger than one campaign. The land question, aristocratic power, court factionalism, weakened military structures, and frontier pressure had been gathering for decades. Manzikert would matter enormously, but not because one battlefield magically destroyed the empire. It mattered because the battle struck a structure already strained by choices made long before the armies met. That is why the years after Basil II are so important. They are the quiet corridor before the door breaks open. No single scene announces disaster. No trumpet sounds. No monk writes in the margin, "Here the empire began to fail." The court continues. The church continues. The tax offices continue. The emperor's portrait still appears on coins. The capital still dazzles visitors. The world still calls Byzantium powerful. But in the provinces, land is shifting. In the army, confidence is thinning. At the court, legitimacy is becoming more dependent on arrangement than command. On the frontier, enemies are testing distance. Basil II had left an empire feared by its neighbors. His successors inherited that fear like a family estate and slowly mortgaged it. The tragedy is not that they were all weak. The tragedy is that many of them ruled inside a system still strong enough to hide how quickly strength could vanish when discipline loosened. They did not stand in ruins. They stood in marble halls built by success, and success made warning signs easier to explain away. Soon, explanation would no longer be enough. In the year 1071, the empire would suffer two blows at opposite edges of its world. In Italy, Bari would fall to the Normans, closing the long Byzantine chapter in the old western homeland. In Anatolia, near Manzikert, the emperor would ride east to face the Seljuks. One loss would end a memory, the other would open a wound, and the empire that had survived by shrinking would discover what happened when the land beneath its shield began to slip away. The empire did not break in one place, it broke at the edges. In 1071, two wounds opened on opposite sides of the Byzantine world. In the west, Bari fell to the Normans, ending the last major Byzantine hold in southern Italy, and closing a chapter that had begun with Justinian's dream of restoring Rome. In the east, near Manzikert, Romanos IV Diogenes led an army into Anatolia to confront the Seljuk Turks, hoping to repair a frontier that had been fraying for years. One loss carried the smell of the old Roman past. The other carried the future. Together they revealed something the court had tried not to see. Byzantium still had the language of empire, but its ability to defend the full weight of that language was weakening. Bari mattered because it was not merely a city on the Adriatic coast. It was a memory of Western ambition, the last meaningful thread connecting Constantinople to the Italian world Justinian had once tried to reclaim. For centuries, Byzantine power in Italy had risen, shrunk, adapted and endured through local politics, military pressure, and administrative improvisation. But Norman expansion in southern Italy changed the balance. These were not distant barbarians wandering into a vacuum. They were aggressive, organized, opportunistic, and increasingly skilled at turning local disorder into conquest. When Bari fell in 1071, Byzantium did not lose Rome. Rome had been gone for a long time. It lost the last strong proof that its Western imperial inheritance still had a military body. A harbour worker in Bari might not have described the event in those terms. He would have known the smell of salt, wet rope, fish, oil, and fear. He would have seen ships held in the harbour, soldiers moving along walls, officials trying to preserve order while everyone understood that the old flag above the city no longer guaranteed protection. The imperial seals, the tax documents, the Greek-speaking officials, these things had weight only as long as force stood behind them. When force failed, paperwork became memory. But Bari was only half the year's judgment. The greater wound opened in the east. Anatolia had become the empire's military spine after the losses of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. It was not just territory, it was depth. It gave Byzantium soldiers, taxes, roads, staging grounds, fortresses, and time. If enemies pushed into Anatolia and stayed, Constantinople would no longer be protected by distance in the same way. The capital might still have walls, but walls are the last defense, not the first sign of strength. Romanos IV understood the danger. He was not simply an emperor chasing glory. He came to power in 1068 in a world where the eastern frontier demanded action. Seljuk raids and movements had destabilized regions that the empire could not afford to treat as expendable. The court had spent years drifting through faction, aristocratic competition, and military neglect. Romanos tried to restore discipline and confront the problem directly. The decision was rational. That is what makes the tragedy sharper. He needed to show that the emperor still commanded the army. He needed to recover credibility. He needed to check Seljuk pressure before Anatolia became too porous to control. He needed to prove to soldiers and aristocrats alike that the throne was more than ceremony wrapped around hesitation. So he marched east. The campaign that ended at Manzikert in 1071 was not a clean drama of one strong army against another in a simple contest of destiny. The sources are complicated. Numbers are uncertain. Later accounts shape the memory of the battle according to political needs. But the broad consequence is clear. Romanos IV faced Alp Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, near Manzikert, and suffered defeat. The emperor himself was captured. For Byzantine imagination, that was almost unbearable. An emperor could lose a battle. An emperor captured by a foreign ruler struck deeper. The imperial body had been touched. Yet even here, the darker truth is that Manzikert did not automatically destroy Byzantium. Alp Arslan did not immediately turn one battlefield victory into a complete conquest of the empire. Romanos was treated with a degree of political pragmatism and released after terms were arranged. The battle was disastrous, but it was not by itself the end of Anatolia. The catastrophe came afterward. The empire survived the field, it failed the aftermath. In Constantinople and across the ruling elite, Romanos's defeat became an opportunity for faction. His enemies moved against him. The Ducas family and court interests did not unite around the urgent need to stabilize the frontier. Instead, civil conflict followed. Romanos was deposed, blinded, and died soon after. The empire turned inward at the exact moment when Anatolia needed a coordinated response. This is the pattern that made Manzikert fatal. A military defeat became a political breakdown. A political breakdown became a frontier collapse. A frontier collapse became a demographic, fiscal, and strategic transformation. On the eastern roads, people would have felt the unraveling before any historian named it. Imagine an Anatolian village after repeated raids and shifting authority. A family listens for hoofbeats beyond the fields. Smoke from the hearth mixes with dust pushed under the door. The old tax demand still exists somewhere in an imperial register, but the men who once enforced it now arrive less reliably. Soldiers pass through without staying. New armed groups appear. Local magnates make their own bargains. The village does not know whether tomorrow's riders will speak for the emperor, a Turkish commander, a rebel, a landlord, or no state at all. This is how empire disappears from ordinary life. Not always with a proclamation. Sometimes with uncertainty over who will come down the road. Anatolia's destabilization after 1071 damaged Byzantium at a level more serious than prestige. It weakened recruitment, it disrupted taxation, it exposed roads and towns, it reduced the state's ability to generate the very resources needed to recover. The loss was not merely land on a map. It was the erosion of the system that had allowed Byzantium to survive after the 7th century. For centuries, Anatolia had absorbed shock. Now, Anatolia itself became the shock. The court in Constantinople still had intelligence, ceremony, wealth, and diplomatic skill. But the gap between the capital and the frontier widened dangerously. Emperors could still be crowned. Decrees could still be sealed, the church could still pray. But the imperial center no longer controlled the eastern interior with the same confidence. A capital can glitter while its recruitment base collapses. A palace can debate legitimacy while roads become unsafe. The Seljuk victory at Manzikert mattered, but Byzantine disunity magnified it. That distinction is essential. If the empire had responded with coherence, the defeat might have become a severe crisis rather than a structural turning point. Instead, competing claimants, aristocratic ambition, and court politics turned military emergency into fragmentation. The old disease after Basil II had reached the battlefield. The empire's enemies did not need Byzantine politics to be suicidal, but they benefited when it was. In the same year, the loss of Bari removed the western edge of the old Justinianic dream. The Normans were not finished. Their ambitions would soon threaten Byzantine interests more directly in the Balkans and the Adriatic world. The empire now faced pressure from men who had learned how to build power from mobility, violence, opportunism, and feudal energy. In the west, the old Roman restoration was gone. In the east, the Anatolian shield was cracking. The year 1071, therefore, should not be remembered as one battle alone. It was a revelation. It revealed that the empire's military system had lost resilience. It revealed that the court could not easily turn crisis into unity. It revealed that old territories could vanish while the capital still performed confidence. It revealed that enemies on different frontiers did not need to coordinate in order to expose the same weakness. Byzantium had survived by adapting to loss. But this loss struck the mechanism of adaptation itself. The human cost spread slowly. Refugees moved, towns changed hands, local churches faced new political realities. Soldiers who had expected pay found uncertainty. Landowners made arrangements. Peasant communities learned to survive between powers. Merchants adjusted routes. Monasteries watched donors disappear or military insecurity grow. The map did not only change in imperial archives, it changed in harvests, marriages, markets, and graves. A frontier is not a line, it is a life, and when it moves, lives are rearranged. For Romanus IV, the tragedy was personal and political. He had tried to do what the moment demanded, take the army east and confront a serious threat. His failure was real, but his punishment revealed the deeper sickness of the system around him. An empire that blinds an emperor after defeat may think it is settling legitimacy. In truth, it may be teaching every enemy that the state is more dangerous to itself than to them. There is no need to turn Romanos into a pure hero. He made choices. He misjudged risks. His campaign ended badly, but he also stood at the intersection of problems not created by him alone: aristocratic power, court rivalry, military weakening, frontier instability, and the long afterlife of decisions made after Basil's death. Manzikert became his name because history often attaches structural failure to one body. It is easier to remember a captured emperor than a generation of administrative drift. Yet the empire did not die. That is the other half of the story. After 1071, Byzantium was wounded, humiliated, and territorially shaken, but it still had Constantinople. It still had administrative talent. It still had diplomacy. It still had wealthy and ambitious families. It still had enemies whose rivalries could be exploited. It still had the ability, under the right ruler, to bargain with disaster. That ruler would come from the Komnenos family. Alexius I Komnenos would inherit not a stable empire, but a crisis map. Normans in the west, Turks in Anatolia, Pechenegs and other pressures in the Balkans, a treasury under strain, an army needing reconstruction, a court full of danger, a state forced to look outward for help while trying not to admit how desperate that help had become. He would save Byzantium, but he would not save it for free. To buy time, Alexius would make bargains with foreign powers, especially Venice. He would call for assistance from the Christian West in ways that helped set the conditions for the Crusades. He would rebuild authority through family, diplomacy, and military improvisation. He would prove once again that Byzantium could survive a disaster that should have ended it. But each act of rescue would open a new debt. The empire had lost the confidence of its edges. Now it would begin selling pieces of its future to defend the center. When Alexius Komnenos came to power in 1081, he did not inherit an empire. He inherited an emergency. The old maps still existed. The ceremonies still existed. Constantinople still stood above the Bosporus with its domes, walls, harbors, and imperial confidence. But beyond the capital, the world had become dangerously unstable. Anatolia was wounded after Manzikert. Norman power was rising in the west. The Balkans were threatened. The treasury was strained. The army needed rebuilding. The court was filled with families who understood that a weak emperor could become an opportunity. Alexius was not stepping onto a throne. He was stepping into a collapsing room and trying to decide which wall to hold first. The first danger came quickly from the west. Robert Guiscard and the Normans pushed across the Adriatic, threatening Byzantine territory in the Balkans. In 1081, at Dyrrhachium, Alexios faced them and suffered defeat. It was a brutal introduction to the new reality. The emperor had courage, but courage did not fill the ranks. He had a capital, but the capital could not fight every war alone. He had the imperial title, but the title could not rebuild a broken army overnight. So Alexios did what Byzantine emperors had often done when strength alone was not enough. He bargained. He looked to Venice. The Venetians had ships. Byzantium needed ships. The Normans threatened imperial positions across the Adriatic world, and naval help mattered. In 1082, Alexios granted Venice major commercial privileges through a crucible, giving Venetian merchants advantages inside Byzantine markets and ports. It was an emergency decision made under pressure. In the immediate moment, it made sense. The emperor needed naval support more urgently than he needed to preserve an ideal economic future. But states often sell tomorrow in the language of necessity. A merchant in Constantinople would have understood the consequence before the court admitted it. Imagine him near the warehouses by the harbour, the air thick with salt, wool, pitch, lamp oil and damp rope. He watches Venetian traders unload goods with privileges he cannot match. Their documents carry exemptions. Their ships come with protection. Their counting tables are busy. The imperial government still speaks as if it controls the city's commerce, but inside its own harbours, foreign merchants have begun to occupy a favoured place. No trumpet announces dependency. It arrives as paperwork. For Alexios, the bargain bought time. That matters. He was not foolish. He was not casually handing the economy to foreigners out of weakness of mind. He was ruling under severe pressure, and in such moments, the question is rarely whether a decision is clean. The question is, which damage can be survived? The Norman threat had to be answered. The treasury had to be stretched. The army had to be rebuilt. The emperor had to remain alive long enough for policy to matter. Alexius survived because he understood that Byzantium still had weapons beyond the battlefield. Family networks, marriage alliances, court hierarchy, diplomacy, religious language, strategic gifts, titles, promises, delays. He turned the Komnenos family into a governing structure, binding relatives and aristocrats closer to the throne. He did not try to rule as an isolated, sacred figure floating above politics. He ruled through blood, obligation, patronage, calculation, and controlled access. It was not the old Roman state of pure administrative confidence. It was a family empire wearing imperial robes. That made it resilient. It also made it personal. The Komnenian system restored a measure of strength because Alexios knew how to pull powerful people into his orbit. Instead of allowing aristocratic families to stand entirely outside the throne, he made them part of the imperial household's architecture. Rank, marriage, title, and service became ways to bind ambition to the emperor. This did not eliminate danger, but it made danger negotiable. Byzantium had survived before by becoming smaller. Now it survived by becoming more intimate. The court became less an abstract machine and more a web of kinship and controlled privilege. To outsiders, the emperor still appeared surrounded by sacred ceremony. Inside the ruling class, power moved through family connections, favors, military commands, marriages, and careful humiliation. Alexios had learned from the disasters after Basil II that great families could not simply be ignored. They had to be managed, absorbed, watched, and used. Meanwhile, the Eastern question remained. Anatolia had not been fully recovered after Manzikert. Turkish power and settlement had altered the interior. Roads, cities, farms, and fortresses no longer belonged securely to the old imperial order. The empire needed help, but asking for help from the Christian West carried risks Byzantium could not fully control. In 1095, at the Council of Piacenza, envoys from Alexios appealed for military assistance. Pope Urban II would soon preach what became the First Crusade. From the Western point of view, the movement took on its own spiritual and military energy. Armed pilgrimage, holy war, penitence, ambition, land hunger, and religious emotion fused into something larger than Byzantine policy. Alexius had wanted disciplined military aid. What came was an armed movement of unpredictable scale. When the Crusaders began arriving near Constantinople, the emperor faced a strange problem. The West had answered, but not in the form he preferred. These were not simply hired soldiers who could be fitted neatly into Byzantine command. They were princes, knights, poor pilgrims, armed followers, religious zealots, opportunists, and men whose understanding of the East was often crude, suspicious, or hostile. Constantinople watched them with fascination and alarm. To Western eyes, the Byzantine court could seem wealthy, ceremonious, evasive, perhaps too refined to be trusted. To Byzantine eyes, many crusaders looked violent, undisciplined, hungry, and dangerously ignorant of the political landscape they had entered. Both sides claimed Christianity. Neither side fully understood the other. Mutual suspicion began almost immediately, and suspicion would deepen into one of the great tragedies of medieval history. Alexios handled the First Crusade with caution. He required oaths from Crusader leaders, seeking promises that former Byzantine territories recovered from Muslim control would be returned to the empire. In 1097, Nicaea was recovered, but even that success revealed the tension between Byzantine strategy and Crusader expectation. The cities surrendered to Byzantine forces, denying the Crusaders the plunder they may have expected. To Alexios, this was disciplined statecraft. To some Crusaders, it felt like manipulation. The alliance worked, and it poisoned itself while working. That is the Komnenian paradox. The First Crusade helped Byzantium regain parts of Western Anatolia and relieve some immediate pressure. It redirected violence eastward. It created Latin states in the Levant that would become both buffers and complications. It reminded the world that Byzantium could still make international events turn in its favor. But it also brought armed Western power deep into Byzantine affairs. A clerk in the palace might record oaths, names, gifts, routes, and arrangements with careful ink. The parchment could make the process look orderly. Yet outside, thousands of armed men had crossed into the imperial world with motives no document could fully contain. Their horses needed fodder, their men needed food, their leaders wanted honor, their priests spoke of salvation. Their swords did not always distinguish between ally and obstacle. The empire had invited help, it had not invited control. The difference would become harder to defend. Under Alexius and his successors, the Komnenian restoration gave Byzantium one of its last periods of meaningful recovery. John II Komnenos continued the work with a reputation for discipline and military seriousness. He campaigned in the Balkans and Anatolia, maintained pressure against enemies, and strengthened the dynasty's image as a ruling house capable of action rather than mere survival. Then came Manuel I Komnenos. Manuel was charismatic, ambitious, outward-looking, and deeply involved in the politics of the Mediterranean world. His reign from 1143 to 1180 brought Byzantine diplomacy and military activity into contact with Hungary, the Crusader states, the Italian maritime powers, the papacy, and the broader Western aristocratic world. He understood prestige as policy. He wanted Byzantium not only to survive, but to appear again as a great imperial actor among kings. For a time it worked. Foreign rulers still had to consider Constantinople. The court remained dazzling. Byzantine diplomacy moved across borders with sophistication. The emperor could influence Crusader politics, Balkan affairs, and Eastern Mediterranean alignments. Manuel cultivated Western-style chivalric culture in some ways, but never stopped acting as a Byzantine emperor whose claim to superiority was built into the architecture of his office. Yet Manuel's ambition also stretched the system. The Komnenian restoration had never fully reversed the deep structural damage after Manzikert. The empire had recovered parts of the coast and western Anatolia, but the interior remained transformed. The treasury was not infinite. The army depended heavily on aristocratic and foreign elements. The economy had ceded privileges to Italian merchants. The state could still act powerfully, but not without cost. In 1176, at Myriokephalon, Manuel suffered a serious defeat against the Seljuks. It was not another Manzikert in the simple sense. The empire did not collapse immediately. Manuel remained emperor. Byzantine power continued, but Myriokephalon carried a psychological weight because it revealed that the dream of fully reversing Turkish power in Anatolia had become far harder than imperial ambition wanted to admit. The road east was not closed in one day, but it was no longer a road back to the old world. A soldier returning from that campaign might remember not the language of grand strategy, but the narrowness of mountain passes, the smell of sweat trapped under armor, the panic of animals, the splintering of wagons, the shouted confusion when an army discovers that terrain itself has become an enemy. The emperor's plan may have looked coherent in council. On the ground, logistics judged it without mercy. Myriokephalon did what certain defeats do. It made limits visible. After Manuel's death in 1180, the Komnenian structure weakened quickly. The strength of the system had depended heavily on capable rulers and tightly managed elite networks. When that control faltered, the old problems returned with sharper edges: succession instability, aristocratic competition, resentment against Latins, economic dependence, and a dangerous gap between imperial performance and administrative depth. The resentment towards Latins in Constantinople became especially volatile. Italian merchants had grown powerful inside Byzantine commercial life. Their privileges, wealth, and foreign identity made them visible targets in moments of tension. In 1182, violence erupted in the massacre of the Latins in Constantinople, a grim sign that economic resentment, religious suspicion, and political instability had fused into hatred. This was not an isolated outburst without consequence. It deepened the bitterness between Byzantium and the West. Then, in 1185, the Normans sacked Thessalonica, the empire's second city. The shock exposed how vulnerable Byzantine power had become when the Komnenian system fractured. Thessalonica was not a frontier outpost. Its suffering revealed that the empire's defenses, politics, and confidence were no longer aligned. The fall of the Komnenian order followed soon after, and with it the last great restoration before the catastrophe of 1204. Alexios had saved Byzantium by opening doors. Venetian merchants entered through one. Crusader armies entered through another. Western politics, Latin resentment, maritime privilege, crusading ambition, and commercial competition all became part of the empire's internal world. In the short term, these connections helped Byzantium survive. In the long term, they made the empire more exposed to forces it could influence, but not command. That was the bargain. Time purchased with dependency, recovery purchased with concessions, security purchased with outsiders who learned the roads, harbors, weaknesses, wealth, and divisions of the empire they had come to assist. Byzantium had always been skilled at using other powers. It had bribed, converted, married, flattered, delayed, and divided enemies for centuries. The difference now was that the balance had shifted. The empire could still manipulate, but it was increasingly being pulled into systems larger than itself. Italian maritime capitalism, papal crusading energy, Norman aggression, Seljuk pressure, Balkan politics, and aristocratic family rule. The sacred empire had survived again, but its saviors had taken notes. And the next time Western armies came to Constantinople, they would not arrive as uncertain guests waiting for imperial instructions. They would come with debts, grievances, ships, priests, princes, and hunger. They would come beneath the sign of the cross, and they would do to Constantinople what no Muslim army had ever done. The men who broke Constantinople came with crosses on their shoulders. That is what made the wound different. The city had feared Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Turks, and Normans. It had been surrounded, threatened, starved, shaken, and tested across centuries. Its walls had carried the memory of siege like a second skin. But in 1204, the army that entered Constantinople did not arrive as a pagan enemy or an Islamic conqueror. It came from the Christian West, under the language of crusade, sailing with Venetian ships, wrapped in debt, ambition, resentment, and holy rhetoric. The betrayal did not begin with one sword stroke. It began with a bargain. The Fourth Crusade had been preached as a campaign to recover Jerusalem. But crusades required ships, food, money, leadership, and discipline. And discipline was often the first thing to fail when faith met logistics. The Crusaders contracted Venice to transport them, but they could not fully pay what they owed. Venice, a maritime republic with sharp commercial interests, did not treat the problem as a spiritual embarrassment. It treated it as leverage. A holy expedition had become a financial instrument. The first diversion came at Zara in 1202, a Christian city on the Adriatic. The Crusaders attacked it, despite the obvious contradiction of a crusading army turning violence against fellow Christians. The act shocked some contemporaries and drew papal condemnation, but the machinery of the campaign kept moving. Once the crusade had crossed that line, another became easier to cross. Then came Byzantine politics. Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II Angelos, offered the Crusaders an extraordinary promise: money, military support, and church union with Rome if they helped restore him and his father to the Byzantine throne. To the Crusader leaders and the Venetians, this appeared to solve several problems at once. Debts could be paid, the crusade could be financed, Constantinople could be made useful, the spiritual mission could continue, at least in theory. But theory was already rotting. Byzantine succession politics had always been dangerous, but now they were being internationalized. A claimant to the imperial throne was inviting a foreign army to solve a palace problem. The decision may have looked practical to those trapped inside immediate need, yet it opened the capital to men who did not understand Byzantine politics, did not love the city, and increasingly viewed its wealth as both temptation and compensation. Constantinople was not merely a city to them. It was a treasury behind walls. When the Crusader fleet approached in 1203, the visual shock must have been immense. Ships crowded the waters near the city. Latin knights, Venetian sailors, priests, common soldiers, and ambitious nobles looked toward the greatest Christian capital in the world. For some, Constantinople was a marvel. For others, it was suspicious, decadent, treacherous, too rich, too Greek, too unwilling to obey the religious and political expectations of the West. The Byzantines looked back with their own fear and contempt. To them, the Latins could seem crude, violent, greedy, and spiritually arrogant. The memory of past tensions, the economic power of Italian merchants, the massacre of the Latins in 1182, and decades of mutual suspicion had poisoned trust long before the first wall was breached. Both sides used the word Christian. They did not mean the same civilization by it. In 1203, the Crusaders helped restore Isaac II and his son Alexius IV to power. The promise now had to be paid. That was the problem. The restored regime could not easily produce what had been promised. The treasury was not a magical vault waiting to satisfy Crusader expectation. Raising money meant taxation, confiscation, melting precious objects, and alienating a population that already saw the Latin presence as humiliation. The emperor's agreement with foreign soldiers became a burden placed on Byzantine subjects. A craftsman in Constantinople might have watched officials enter a church or storehouse to seize metal for payment. He would not have experienced this as diplomacy. He would have heard the scrape of objects moved from sacred spaces, the murmur of anger, the dull ring of precious metal becoming fiscal emergency. Outside, Latin soldiers waited. Inside, the city's own rulers tried to convert legitimacy into coin. The sacred capital was being pawned. Alexius IV had gained the throne through foreign force, and that made him weak the moment he sat upon it. He owed too much to outsiders and commanded too little love inside the city. To the Crusaders, he was a debtor. To many Byzantines, he was a puppet. To the political elite, he was an unstable risk. The more he tried to satisfy the Latins, the more he enraged his own people. The more he hesitated, the more the Crusaders doubted him. By early 1204, the arrangement collapsed. Alexius IV was overthrown and killed after the rise of Alexios V Ducas, called Murtzouphlos. The new ruler rejected the obligations to the Crusaders and prepared to defend the city. From a Byzantine perspective, this may have looked like a recovery of dignity. From the Crusader perspective, it looked like betrayal, unpaid debt, and justification for attack. Both sides now had their story. Only one side had the army outside the walls. In April 1204, the Crusaders assaulted Constantinople. The city that had resisted so many enemies now faced men who knew it was wealthy, divided, and politically exhausted. Venetian seamanship and Crusader violence combined against the defences. The fighting was brutal. Fire spread. Fear moved through streets where imperial ceremony had once trained people to believe the capital was protected by more than stone. The walls were breached. Then came the sack. Medieval sources describe looting, violence, desecration, and chaos. Some details are shaped by the horror of the writers who witnessed or remembered it, but the broad reality is beyond doubt. Constantinople was plundered by the very crusading movement that claimed to fight for Christ. Churches were stripped, relics were seized, precious objects were carried away, palaces were emptied. The city's accumulated wealth, artistic, sacred, imperial, commercial, became the prize of men who had begun their journey speaking of Jerusalem. In Hagia Sophia, the violation was not only material, it was symbolic. The greatest church of the Byzantine world, the Sacred Heart of imperial Christianity in the East, became a scene of humiliation. Later accounts emphasized desecration in ways meant to convey moral catastrophe. Whether every detail was exactly as told matters less than the meaning preserved by Byzantine memory. The sanctuary had been entered not by outsiders to the faith, but by fellow Christians whose greed had overcome the language of salvation. For Byzantium, 1204 was not merely defeat. It was a theological insult. Imagine a scribe after the sack, standing near a shelf where manuscripts had been scattered or taken. The room smells of smoke, dust, wax, and damp plaster. A broken cover lies on the floor, Ink has smeared where a page was stepped on. He picks up a fragment, not because it can save the empire, but because hands trained by a lifetime of copying cannot watch memory disappear without reaching for something. Outside, men argue over silver. Somewhere else, a relic is being carried away. The empire's archive has become loot. That scene reveals the deeper wound. Constantinople had been more than a fortress. It was a storage house of continuity, Roman law, Christian relics, imperial ceremony, Greek learning, administrative memory, artistic splendor, and the belief that the city stood at the center of sacred history. The sack scattered that confidence. Objects that once taught Byzantines who they were now traveled west as trophies, relics, decoration, and proof of conquest. After the city fell, the Latin Empire was established in Constantinople, but it was a poor imitation of what it replaced. The conquerors had taken the capital, not the living structure that made Byzantine rule work. They inherited a wounded city, hostile populations, rival successor states, and a region too complex to be controlled by plunder and titles. Byzantine elites fled and reorganized elsewhere. Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond became centers of competing Greek power, each claiming fragments of legitimacy from the broken imperial world. The empire had been shattered, but not erased. In Nicaea especially, the Byzantine political tradition found a temporary refuge. Emperors, clergy, administrators, and soldiers could preserve the claim that Constantinople had been stolen, not replaced. This mattered because legitimacy can survive exile if enough people believe the center has been occupied by force rather than morally superseded. The Latin rulers had the city. The Byzantines in exile kept the story. Yet the cost was irreversible. Even when Constantinople would be recovered in 1261, the old unity would not return. The sack had damaged the city's wealth, population, institutions, and confidence. It had intensified hatred between Greek East and Latin West. It had made appeals for Western help both necessary and humiliating in later centuries. It had taught Byzantium that Christian language could hide commercial predation and political violence. After 1204, distrust became structural. The empire could no longer imagine Western Christendom as merely wayward kin. It had seen what armed kinship could do when guided by debt and opportunity. That memory would haunt every later negotiation with Rome, every proposed church union, every plea for aid against the Ottomans. When Byzantine emperors later turned westward for help, they did so with the knowledge that the West had once answered need by taking the city itself. This is why 1204 stands apart from other disasters. Manzikert wounded the frontier. 1204 wounded the soul of the state. The city had fallen before the final fall. Its sacred inviolability had been broken. Its treasures had been taken. Its people had learned that the walls could fail not only against enemies of another faith, but against men who prayed to the same Christ and then stripped the altar. A state can recover territory more easily than trust. The human cost continued long after the sack. Families were displaced, churches were impoverished, artisans lost patrons, merchants adjusted to new masters, clergy argued over authority, soldiers served successor states. Refugees carried stories of fire, theft, and humiliation across the Greek world. Children born after 1204 inherited not simply a political division, but a wound narrated at home, in churches, in courts, and in exile. The Byzantine idea survived by becoming memory under occupation. And memory can be powerful. It can preserve identity. It can train patience. It can justify resistance. But memory cannot replace a treasury, repair every wall, restore lost population, or undo the economic advantage gained by foreign merchants. The empire in exile could dream of return. It could organize, fight, negotiate, and wait. It could produce rulers determined to reclaim the capital. But the world after 1204 was no longer the world before it. Constantinople had been transformed from the unquestioned center of a sacred empire into the prize over which competing powers fought. That transformation would shape everything that followed. In 1261, the city would be recovered. The banners of the Greek emperor would return. The Latin regime would fall. The old capital would once again hear the language of Byzantine rule inside its walls. At first glance, it would seem like resurrection, the sacred city restored, the wound closed, the empire reborn. But resurrection is not the same as recovery. When Michael VIII Palaiologos entered Constantinople, he would inherit not the empire of Basil II, not the restoration of the Komnenoi, not even the wounded but living state before the Fourth Crusade. He would inherit a symbol. And symbols, however sacred, cannot collect taxes from lands no longer controlled. The city would return to Byzantine hands. The empire behind it would not. When Constantinople returned to Byzantine hands in 1261, the city looked like a resurrection. But resurrection can be cruel when the body is still broken. For nearly 60 years, the old capital had lived under Latin rule. The empire that once spoke from Constantinople had survived elsewhere, in exile, in memory, in rival courts, in church claims, in military patience. Nicaea had become the strongest of the Byzantine successor states, preserving the imperial title and slowly building the strength needed to reclaim what had been stolen. The dream was simple to describe and almost impossible to fulfill. Take back the city, restore the emperor, heal the wound of 1204. Michael VIII Palaiologos achieved the impossible. In 1261, forces loyal to the Empire of Nicaea entered Constantinople and recovered the capital almost unexpectedly. The Latin Empire, fragile and impoverished, collapsed. The old city returned to Greek rule. The emperor could once again stand inside the walls of Constantine and claim the inheritance of Rome. For a moment, the symbolism was overwhelming. The usurping Latin order was gone. The sacred capital had been reclaimed. The humiliation of 1204 seemed, at least on the surface, answered by history itself. Michael VIII could present himself not merely as a successful politician, but as the restorer of the Roman world in the East. But Constantinople in 1261 was not the Constantinople of Justinian. It was not the city Basil II had ruled from. It was not even the wounded capital of the Komnenian age. The city had returned. Much of the empire behind it had not. That is the tragedy of the Palaiologan restoration. It restored the center without restoring the system that once made the center powerful. Constantinople still carried unmatched symbolic weight, but symbols require support. A capital needs taxes, ships, soldiers, grain, workshops, population, roads, obedient provinces, and an economy capable of turning imperial command into material action. The restored empire had too little of all of them. Imagine an artisan near the old walls after the recovery. He works with cracked stone, reused timber, and tools that have passed through too many hands. The dust tastes bitter. The lime burns his skin. Around him are buildings that still carry scars from Latin occupation, neglect, fire, and poverty. Officials speak of restoration. Priests speak of providence. But his work is smaller than their language. He is not rebuilding a world. He is patching a wall. That was Byzantium after 1261, a patched wall beneath an imperial title. Michael VIII was clever, ruthless, and politically talented. He had to be. His position was never simple. He had seized power within the Nicaean world and founded the Palaiologan dynasty. His legitimacy required success, and the recovery of Constantinople gave him a triumph no rival could easily dismiss. Yet that triumph also created new burdens. The capital had to be defended, repopulated, repaired, supplied, and made worthy of imperial ceremony again. The city was a prize. It was also an obligation. To hold Constantinople, Michael had to divide attention between too many threats. The Latin West remained dangerous. Charles of Anjou, ruling in southern Italy and Sicily, dreamed of restoring Latin power over Constantinople. Venice, angered by the fall of the Latin Empire and deeply tied to the commercial world created after 1204, remained a threat. Genoa became useful as a counterweight, but reliance on Italian maritime powers only deepened the economic problem that had haunted Byzantium since the Komnenian bargains. The empire had recovered its capital by stepping back into a web of foreign interests. In 1261, Michael had already made an agreement with Genoa through the Treaty of Nymphaeum, seeking naval support against Venice. The logic was understandable. Byzantium needed ships and allies. Genoa needed access. The immediate result strengthened Michael's diplomatic position. The hidden cost was familiar. Another foreign commercial power gained deep privileges within the imperial economy. Venice had once entered as helper and rival. Now Genoa entered as counterweight. Byzantium still knew how to play outsiders against one another. But by the 13th century, the outsiders had ships, capital, colonies, and commercial networks the empire could no longer fully dominate. The old imperial state had once granted privileges from a position of superiority. The restored state now granted them from need. Need changes the meaning of generosity. A Byzantine merchant walking near the harbour could feel the difference. Foreign warehouses stood where imperial confidence once claimed control. Italian ships moved with their own protections, their own communities, their own legal advantages. The smell of pitch, spice, fish, wet rope and coin filled the docks. But not all of that wealth flowed into the emperor's hands. Trade passed through Constantinople, yet the restored empire did not command it as the old state once had. The capital had been reclaimed. Its economy had been shared. Michael VIII also faced a religious problem that would poison his reign. He understood that Western hostility could become fatal. To prevent a new crusade against Constantinople, he pursued church union with Rome. At the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, union was proclaimed, at least formally, as part of his diplomatic strategy. On paper, it was practical. In the churches of Byzantium, it felt like betrayal. For many Orthodox clergy, monks, and laypeople, union with Rome was not an elegant diplomatic tool. It was submission to the same Latin world that had desecrated Constantinople in 1204. The memory of the sack had not faded. Relics taken west, churches violated, families displaced, and sacred spaces humiliated. These were not abstractions. They lived inside Byzantine religious feeling. To ask the people to accept union with Rome for political survival was to ask them to separate theology from memory. They would not do it easily. A monk in Constantinople during this period might hear imperial officials speak of necessity and feel only the old wound reopening. The chapel smells of wax, old stone, and damp cloth. An icon glows in low light. Somewhere outside, diplomats measure danger in treaties and armies. Inside, the monk understands the matter differently. To him, the emperor is not simply making policy, he is bargaining with the faith that gave the empire its meaning. This was the cruelty of Michael's position. If he refused the West, he risked invasion. If he courted the West, he risked his own people. The sacred story that had once helped unify the empire now constrained its diplomacy. Byzantine emperors had long used religion as a language of authority, but after 1204, that language had become sharper, less flexible, more wounded. The same orthodox identity that preserved Byzantine continuity in exile also made compromise with Rome feel almost intolerable. Michael VIII succeeded in preventing some immediate Western threats, but he did not heal the empire. His policies bought time, and time was valuable. Yet much of his energy went toward defending the capital from Latin reconquest and managing Western danger. That focus came with a cost in Anatolia. The eastern frontier, already transformed after Manzikert, continued to suffer from neglect and pressure. Turkish principalities grew in the regions where Byzantine control had thinned. Local defense weakened. The empire spent strength protecting its symbolic heart, while the body behind it kept losing ground. Once again, Constantinople dominated the imperial imagination. And, once again, the frontier paid. This was not because Michael failed to understand strategy. It was because the restored empire had too many emergencies and not enough resources. A stronger state might have defended the Balkans, rebuilt the navy, restored Anatolian control, managed Italian merchants, resisted Latin pressure, and preserved church unity. The Paleologan state had to choose, and every choice exposed another weakness. After Michael VIII, the cracks widened. Andronikos II Palaiologos inherited a troubled empire and ruled for a long period, from 1282 to 1328. He reversed the unpopular church union policy, which pleased many within the Orthodox world, but the deeper material pressures remained. The Byzantine navy declined, fiscal constraints grew, military capacity weakened. The state increasingly relied on mercenaries and shifting alliances. Anatolia continued slipping away. One of the most destructive episodes came with the Catalan Company in the early 14th century. These mercenaries were hired to fight Turkish forces in Anatolia, but like many armed solutions purchased by a weak state, they became a crisis of their own. After conflict with Byzantine authorities, they turned violently against imperial territory, ravaging parts of Thrace and Greece. The pattern was brutally familiar. The empire hired force because it lacked enough force, then discovered that hired violence obeys payment better than loyalty. Mercenaries solve one problem by creating another. For ordinary people, this was not policy failure in the abstract. It was burned fields, abandoned homes, stolen animals, ruined churches, and roads no longer safe. A peasant family in Thrace would not care whether the soldiers were technically hired by the emperor before they became predators. The sound of hooves in the distance meant the same thing. Hide grain, move children, pray the men pass quickly. Byzantine weakness had become something civilians could hear coming. The 14th century brought civil wars that further damaged the empire. The conflict between Andronikos II and his grandson Andronikos III weakened central authority. Later, the civil war between John V Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzénos deepened the fragmentation. Aristocrats, foreign allies, Serbs, Bulgarians, Turks, and local factions all found openings in Byzantine instability. Civil war is especially deadly for a shrinking empire. It consumes the very resources needed for survival. It teaches provinces to look for protection elsewhere. It invites outsiders into internal disputes. It makes the emperor appear less like the center of sacred order and more like one claimant among many. Every faction claims legitimacy. Every army needs supplies. Every victory leaves bitterness behind. Byzantium had once used diplomacy to divide its enemies. Now its enemies could use Byzantine politics to divide Byzantium. Meanwhile, a new power was rising in Anatolia and across the Straits, the Ottomans. At first, they were one among several Turkish principalities, but over time they became the force that would transform the region. Their expansion was not merely military luck. They benefited from Byzantine weakness, frontier opportunities, Ghazi warfare traditions, political flexibility, and the ability to absorb men, lands, and loyalties in a changing world. As Byzantine territory contracted, Ottoman power moved into the spaces left behind. The contrast became painful. The Paleologan emperors still possessed the old title. The Ottomans possessed momentum. Constantinople still contained sacred memory. The Ottomans built future capacity. Byzantine diplomacy still searched for help among divided Christian powers. Ottoman rulers increasingly shaped the conditions around the capital itself. By the later 14th century, Constantinople was no longer the command center of a broad imperial state. It was becoming an island of memory inside another power's expanding world. And yet, even now, Byzantium did not simply vanish. This is what makes its final centuries so haunting. The empire had lost too much to be truly strong, but retained too much meaning to disappear quietly. Its scholars preserved texts. Its theologians debated union and doctrine. Its artists created works of severe beauty. Its emperors traveled, negotiated, pleaded, promised, and maneuvered. Its people still worshipped beneath domes that carried the weight of centuries. Its name still mattered. But meaning without material power becomes fragile. The Paleologan age was full of brilliance, but it was the brilliance of candlelight in a narrowing room. The culture remained alive even as the state weakened. The intellect remained sharp even as the treasury thinned. The sacred ceremonies continued even as the territory shrank. The empire could still produce beauty, but beauty could not restore Anatolia. It could still produce theology, but theology could not rebuild the navy. It could still produce memory, but memory could not pay mercenaries who wanted coin. Byzantium, after 1261, had reclaimed the city that defined it. That victory became its final paradox. The recovered capital demanded defense beyond what the restored empire could afford. It pulled attention away from the eastern frontier. It forced emperors into humiliating diplomacy with the West. It required repairs, ceremonies, food, and soldiers from a state whose resources were no longer imperial in scale. Constantinople was the proof that Byzantium still lived, and the burden that revealed how little life remained. By the time the final century approached, the question had changed. Earlier, Byzantium had asked, how do we restore the Roman world? Then it had asked, how do we survive after losing so much of it? Now it asked something colder. How long can a sacred capital endure when it has become almost the whole empire? The answer would come in 1453. By then, the Ottoman state would be strong enough to do what Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and earlier Turks had failed to do. The walls would still stand. Hagia Sophia would still rise. The emperor would still bear the Roman name. Priests would still pray. The people would still remember that their city had survived disasters before. But this time, the enemy would not merely test the city. It would bring the tools to end the question. At dawn on the 29th of May, 1453, the city that had called itself Rome for more than 1,000 years began to break. The morning did not arrive like a clean ending. It came through smoke, dust, shouting, bells, collapsing stone, and men too exhausted to understand that they were living inside the last page of an age. Constantinople had been under siege since April. For weeks, the Ottoman army had pressed against the Theodosian walls with cannon, manpower, engineering, patience, and imperial ambition. Mehmed II had not come to frighten the city, he had come to take it. The walls had been repaired again and again. Men carried stones, beams, earth, barrels, and whatever else could fill the wounds torn open by artillery. Each night, defenders worked by torchlight, while the cities slept badly behind them. The walls that had once seemed like a theological argument in stone now looked increasingly human, patched, shaken, tired, and dependent on hands that could not rest. Constantine, the 11th Palaeologus, still bore the imperial title. That title was ancient enough to feel almost unreal by then. It had passed through emperors who had ruled continents, emperors who had fled rebellion, emperors who had blinded rivals, emperors who had restored provinces, emperors who had lost them again, emperors who had argued with monks, begged the West, hired mercenaries, and watched the world narrow around the Bosporus. Now it belonged to a man with too few soldiers. Among the defenders was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese commander whose military experience gave the defense precious strength. His presence revealed the final contradiction of Byzantine survival. The empire still needed foreigners to hold the walls of its own capital. Genoese, Venetians, Greeks, and others stood together in the city's last defense, not because the old Roman state had recovered, but because the final crisis had forced old rivalries into temporary discipline. Outside, Mehmed had gathered a different kind of order. The Ottoman army represented a younger imperial system, still expanding, still hungry, still capable of turning ambition into logistics. Cannon hammered the ancient defences, ships threatened the waters, troops waited for the assault. The Sultan understood the prize before him. Constantinople was not simply a fortified city. It was the key to a new imperial geography, the bridge between continents, the symbolic capital that would allow Ottoman power to inherit more than land. To take Constantinople was to take a world's imagination. Inside the city, imagination had become one of the last defences. In Hagia Sophia, prayers rose beneath the dome. The union of churches with Rome, accepted by some leaders as a desperate diplomatic strategy, remained bitterly controversial among many Orthodox believers. Western aid had come, but not enough. The memory of 1204 had never left. Even in the final siege, salvation from the West carried the taste of humiliation. A priest moving through the church that last night would have seen faces hollowed by hunger, smoke, and waiting. The marble floor was cold beneath tired feet. Candle wax softened in the heat of bodies. Incense hung in the air, mixing with the smell of damp wool, oil, and fear. A woman might press her hand against an icon, not because she expected strategy from it, but because every other form of protection had become uncertain. This was not politics anymore. It was the human body asking history for mercy. But history does not grant mercy because a city remembers greatness. The final Ottoman assault came before sunrise. Waves of attackers pressed the defences. The fighting was savage and confused, the kind of violence where strategy narrows into gates, ladders, wounds, and exhaustion. Justiniani was wounded and withdrew, a moment that damaged morale at the worst possible time. The defenders were already stretched thin. Once pressure concentrated and breaches opened, the balance collapsed. Later accounts would turn Constantine XI's final moments into legend. Some say he cast aside imperial symbols and disappeared into the fighting. The exact details remain uncertain. That uncertainty should remain. But the meaning is clear enough. The last emperor did not leave behind a new system, a successor, or a recovered state. He left behind a death that could be remembered. And sometimes memory is what remains when power has nothing else to give. When Ottoman soldiers entered Constantinople, the city's long resistance ended. Streets that had heard Roman law, Greek prayer, imperial procession, theological argument, market noise, and refugee footsteps now heard the sound of conquest. Doors were broken, families hid, churches filled with terror. The city that had once contained the administrative mind of an empire became, in the first hours after the fall, a place of bodies, fear, and possession. A sailor near the Golden Horn might have understood the change before anyone announced it. The harbour water still moved, ropes still creaked, smoke still drifted across the surface, but the authority behind the city had shifted. The seals, the titles, the old claims, the imperial rituals, all of them had reached the edge of what they could protect. Constantinople had fallen. Rome in the east was gone as a state. Mehmed II entered not as a raider, but as a conqueror who intended to rule. That distinction mattered. He did not merely destroy Constantinople. He transformed it. The city would become the Ottoman capital, later known as Istanbul, a center of Muslim imperial power, administration, architecture, trade, and ambition. Hagia Sophia itself would be converted into a mosque, becoming a symbol not of disappearance, but of transfer, sacred space rewritten by a new empire. The old city did not vanish. It changed masters. That is why the fall of Byzantium is not only a story of death. It is also a story of inheritance. Ottoman rule absorbed the geography of Constantinople and the prestige of its location. The Sultan could imagine himself not merely as a Turkish ruler, but as a new kind of Roman heir, master of the city that had defined imperial legitimacy for centuries. Conquest did not erase the power of the place. It proved that the place still mattered. The Byzantine state ended. The Byzantine world did not. Its scholars carried Greek learning westward and elsewhere, contributing to intellectual currents already moving through late medieval and Renaissance Europe. Its law, art, theology, liturgy, diplomacy, court culture, and political imagination continued in fragments across Orthodox worlds. Moscow, Balkan churches, Greek communities, monastic traditions, and later historians would all inherit pieces of Byzantine memory. Icons survived, manuscripts survived, liturgies survived. The idea of Christian empire survived in altered forms. But survival after death is not the same as victory. The empire had spent centuries mastering endurance. It had survived by relocating Rome to the Bosphorus, by building walls, by fusing Christian authority with imperial ceremony, by shrinking without surrendering its name, by turning diplomacy into art, by paying foreign merchants, by calling crusaders, by recovering a stolen capital, by bargaining with Rome, by hiring soldiers it could barely control, by praying under domes while the map collapsed. Each act worked for a time. Each act also narrowed the future. That is the answer to the question that began in the last candlelight of Hagia Sophia. How long can an empire survive when its sacred story outlives its material power? Longer than anyone expects. Long enough to become legend. Long enough to mistake endurance for restoration. Long enough for its enemies to grow up studying its walls, trading in its harbours, fighting in its politics, and waiting for the day when the sacred performance no longer had enough soldiers behind it. Byzantium's tragedy was never that it failed to survive. It survived brilliantly. That was the tragedy. Because survival became the habit that allowed deeper losses to be explained, absorbed, ritualized, and postponed. A province disappeared, but the capital remained. A frontier broke, but the emperor still reigned. A church was divided, but the liturgy continued. A foreign merchant gained privilege, but the treasury needed ships. A crusader army entered, but the throne needed help. A city was restored, but the resources behind it did not return. Again and again, Byzantium exchanged substance for time. and time was both its genius and its curse. In the final silence after 1453, the old symbols did not suddenly lose meaning. The walls still stood in broken line. Hagia Sophia still dominated the city. The Bosporus still carried ships between worlds. The stones still remembered Greek, Latin, prayer, law, procession, and siege. But the imperial voice that had once claimed to speak as Rome had fallen quiet. No court ceremony could reverse it. No title could rebuild it. No memory could command an army from the dead. And yet, to say Byzantium vanished would be too simple. Empires do not only leave ruins, they leave habits of thought. They leave arguments about legitimacy. They leave art that teaches the eye how to see holiness. They leave laws that travel beyond borders. They leave enemies who imitate them. They leave churches that sing in their shadow. They leave cities whose stones become the stage for another empire's dream. The Ottoman conquest ended Byzantine sovereignty, but it did not erase the Byzantine question. What makes power feel eternal? A war? A capital? A god? A law code? A language? A memory repeated long enough that people kneel before it? Byzantium's answer changed across the centuries. Under Constantine, power was geography made sacred. Under Justinian, it was restoration written in law and stone. Under Heraclius, it was victory arriving too late. Under the iconoclast emperors, it was the dangerous right to define heaven. Under Basil II, it was discipline. Under Alexius, it was bargaining. After 1204, it was wounded memory. After 1261, it was restoration without strength. In 1453, it became silence beneath cannon smoke. The last image is not only an emperor dying at the walls, it is a city changing meaning. The bells fade, the smoke lifts. A new ruler enters. The old empire becomes a memory powerful enough to haunt everyone who claims to replace it. And that is why Byzantium still matters. Not because it was eternal, but because it shows how long a civilization can endure after its first ending. It shows how states survive by changing, and how change can quietly consume the thing being protected. It shows that power is never only armies and never only belief. It is the fragile agreement between story and material force. When the story remains, but the force is gone, the world may still bow for a while, but not forever. If this empire teaches one final lesson, it is this: history does not always destroy what is false. Sometimes it destroys what was once true, but can no longer afford to remain true. Byzantium began as Rome's answer to fear. It ended as Rome's last prayer behind broken walls. And between those two moments lay one of the darkest truths of empire. Survival can preserve a civilization, but it can also teach that civilization how to lose itself slowly, with dignity, with beauty, with ceremony, and with no way back. If you want the next chapter in this dark history series, tell us which empire, dynasty, or civilization should face the same judgment next. Because history is not a list of dates. It is the autopsy of power. And in the silence after Constantinople, the body of Rome was finally opened.